Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Iron Fanfics, back with amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What If Deku Had Dream Manipulation Quirk. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku had always had peculiar dreams. For as long as he could remember, his dreams had been a blank white box that he could shape as he saw fit. Lucid dreaming, the internet said, though peculiar in that he seemed to have been able to do it from birth. If he was optimistic, or perhaps an idiot, he might suggest that it was a pocket dimension resulting from his quirk. But Izuku had lost his optimism a long time ago, finding it too taxing to maintain, and he just so happened to be rather clever. He knew that he was quirkless. He knew what that meant for him and his future. So, at 7 years old, Izuku sat crying in his dreamscape, already feeling hopeless and lost in the world. For the first time, not really expecting it to work, he wished for a friend. A grimy boy with purple hair and a muzzle on his face popped into existence right next to him. The two boys stared at each other for a moment, frozen in shock. Then Izuku sniffled and the other boy instantly scrambled back looking terrified. Izuku quickly raised his hands, smiling his best reassuring all-might smile. It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you, promise. Do you want me to take that off? He gestured to the muzzle, hesitating when the boy flinched at the motion. I won't even have to touch you, okay? I'll stay way over here. He sat down slowly, crossing his legs and keeping his posture relaxed. The other boy's eyes narrowed, but after a second of tugging fruitlessly on the muzzle, he gave up and nodded. Izuku perked up, grinning, and with a wave of his hand the boy was sparkly clean and freed. The boy rubbed his face, eyeing Izuku warily. How did you do that? He croaked out, pausing when he saw his freshly clean body. Was that your quirk? Izuku shook his head, relaxing slightly. Nope. It's because this is a dream. You can do it too, you know. Izuku realized belatedly that that might not be true, but then quickly assured himself that since this was his dream, if he said it then it must be true. Sure enough, the kid's face scrunched up for a second, and then a water bottle appeared in his hands. He startled, then smiled slightly and took a tentative sip. Who are you? Purple asked once he had emptied half the bottle. He still seemed a little wary, but much more relaxed than he had been. My name's Izuku. Izuku said. What's yours? Hitoshi. The boy replied after a moment's hesitation. Why are we here? So we can play, of course. Izuku chirped back, only to quickly grow nervous when he saw the confusion on Hitoshi's face. Unless you don't want to? Hitoshi regarded him for another long moment before seeming to decide something. What are we playing? Izuku shot him a relieved grin. We can play whatever you want. He said enthusiastically. Usually he would ask to play heroes, but Hitoshi seemed nervous and Izuku didn't want to scare him off. Since this is a dream, we can do anything here. We can fly, or pretend we're at the beach, or listen to music. Hitoshi took a second to think, and then nodded slowly. Let's play heroes, he said before quickly adding, but I don't want to be a villain this time. Izuku couldn't help but wonder if Hitoshi's friends also forced him to be the villain in their games as he nodded. That's okay, he said. I'm good at running. Which hero are you gonna be? Eraserhead. Hitoshi replied immediately. I don't know him. Izuku said with a little frown. He thought he knew all the heroes. He's an underground hero. That means he only works at night, and he gets to the really bad guys who are smart enough to do mean stuff in private. He's like a ninja or a spy. Hitoshi explained, fumbling over his words slightly. Whoa, Izuku breathed, eyes wide with wonder. Hitoshi seems pleased with that reaction. Okay, you can be Eraserhead. I'll be Dragon. I'm a super scary fire-breathing villain. Hitoshi grinned at him, lowering himself into a dramatic crouch. Halt, Dragon. Hitoshi says, in stern voice that Izuku thinks is very fitting for a hero. Your life of crime is over. You'll never stop me, Eraserhead. Izuku says, cackling maniacally. In just 3 minutes, this bomb will go off, exploding the whole library. And then, no one will be able to read ever again. Hitoshi glared at him, so viciously that for a second Izuku thought he actually did something wrong. A truly diabolical plan, he muttered. If there is no library, how will the children learn how to feed the stray cats? Izuku tried to hide his giggle behind his hand and failed spectacularly, making Hitoshi pout at him. Fine then, villain, if it's a fight you want, it's a fight you'll get. He launched himself forward with a growl, and Izuku let out a delighted shriek of laughter as he ran away. Izuku quickly found that he liked playing with Hitoshi a lot more than playing with Kaken or his mom. Hitoshi didn't hurt him when he caught up to Izuku, but he didn't treat him like glass either as he tackled him to the floor. Izuku was far more used to running around in the dreamscape than Hitoshi was, so he was able to outrun him for a while, but the other boy got the hang of it quickly. He accidentally scared Hitoshi once when he gave himself a fire-breathing quirk, but quickly showed that the dream fire was harmless. You couldn't feel pain in dreams, after all. Hitoshi then gave himself a quirk that could stop other people's quirks, which was apparently Eraserhead's real quirk. Then Izuku gave himself a speed quirk, and Hitoshi retaliated by turning the ground into jello. They went back and forth like that all night, until they collapsed in a heap, breathing heavily and giggling. Izuku beamed at his new friend, and was delighted to receive a small, hesitant smile in response. And then the ceiling flashed green. Hitoshi jumped in surprise, turning to look at Izuku with wide eyes. "It's okay," Izuku assured him. "That just means we gotta get up soon." Hitoshi didn't seem relieved by that revelation. In fact, he seemed crestfallen. "I don't want to wake up," he whispered. Izuku frowned, wondering where he had pulled Hitoshi from for him to be this nervous to go back. "I'm sorry," Izuku said, feeling guilty. "But we can't stay here. Even if we try, someone'll come and wake us up." Hitoshi teared up, but nodded. Izuku thought that he was very brave. "Can I come back tomorrow?" he asked quietly, in the voice that Izuku used when he already knew the answer was no. "Of course," Izuku said firmly. "It's a dream, you know. You'll come back every time you sleep unless you don't wanna." Hitoshi didn't cry, but it looked like it was a near thing. After a moment of hesitation, he hugged Izuku, and then quickly ran away, all the way back to his own dream. Izuku closed his eyes and willed himself to wake up, and when he opened them he was back in his room, a few minutes before his alarm went off. Izuku told his mom about his dream, like he always did. When he asked if he could try and find Hitoshi to help him, she gently explained to him that he was imaginary, which meant not real. Which was a little disappointing, but it made sense. If no one else wanted to be his friend, it was only logical for him to make his own. From then on, his day progressed as usual. He went to school, got between Kaken and a kid he was being mean to again, got a burn for it, went to the nurse, got scolded for being fragile, went home, smiled, ate dinner, did his homework, and finally got to go back to sleep. As promised, Hitoshi came back that night. Izuku was so happy to see him, he forgot to get rid of his burns like he usually did. Hitoshi noticed immediately, way faster than Izuku's mom did. He fussed over them, even starting to summon bandages, but Izuku just smiled and willed them away. Hitoshi stared at the spot where his burn had been, and then scrunched his face up in concentration. After a moment, he slid his sleeve up to show an unblemished arm, which he seemed amazed by. When Izuku what had been there, Hitoshi just shook his head and said it didn't matter. Izuku thought it was a little unfair that his imaginary friend was being hurt when Izuku wasn't imagining him, but there wasn't much he could do about it. It was like when his mom got a letter in the mail that made her sad, and all Izuku could do was hug her and make silly faces and help her cook. So Izuku grilled Hitoshi about his favorite things, and then proceeded to fill the room with them. Everything from pillows to chocolate to warm plush blankets to a soft moss floor. He tried to summon books, but found they only contained information he already knew, or half-formed ideas he already had. He quickly willed them away, hoping everything else would be all right. Luckily, it seemed like it was, because Hitoshi smiled so wide Izuku thought his face might split in half. It was weird to see it after he had been mostly stoic or at least tried to hide his smiles for their entire first meeting. Izuku found he liked this expression a lot more. After clarifying that yes, Hitoshi could summon anything he wanted, but something like a whale is probably a bad idea. Hitoshi made something called a capture weapon, which was apparently the thing Eraserhead used to arrest villains. It was supposed to be worn around the neck, but it enormous on Hitoshi, the pile of fabric nearly covering his whole torso. Izuku taught him how to adjust the size of things in the dreamscape, but even after that he kept getting himself tangled up in it. Still, instead of giving up, he got a determined look on his face and spent hours practicing. After a while, Izuku got bored of just watching and made one for himself too, and the two of them helped each other train. The next morning, Izuku cheerfully told his mom that Hitoshi had come back and was helping him learn to be a hero, not noticing the worried glance she gave him. He had the same day as usual, went to school, got shoved in the hall, got scolded by a teacher, came home, smiled, ate dinner, and went to sleep. Again, Hitoshi was waiting for him. They played and trained and ran back and forth, pretending that they hadn't seen each other's wounds in the seconds before they had been willed away. Izuku found out that Hitoshi wanted to be a hero too, and enthusiastically encouraged him. He also found out that the other boy didn't like All Might very much, which was weird, but Eraserhead was pretty cool too, so he could allow it. Hitoshi even managed to figure out how to show Izuku some videos he had found online of the hero, though they were a bit blurry and choppy when filtered through the boy's memory. He had asked if it was possible to bring Eraserhead himself there, and without thinking Izuku shook his head. "No," he said. "We can't make real people." Hitoshi went very still, and it took Izuku a second to realize why. Had Hitoshi not known that he was imaginary? "It's okay," Izuku said with an awkward smile. "I don't mind." Hitoshi shot him a look full of all sorts of emotions he couldn't identify, and then gave a determined nod. "Let's be heroes," he said, holding out a hand. "Together." Izuku may have teared up a little, or he may have cried so hard he couldn't breathe. Either way, neither of them mentioned it again, but they both threw themselves into hero training. They quickly got a routine set up, where both of them would research and practice during the day, and then bring whatever they learned into the dreamscape at night and teach it to each other. Within 2 weeks, Izuku could hardly imagine a life without Hitoshi there to help him with his goals. He spent most of the second week studying images of the night sky and the constellations until he knew it like the back of his hand and was able to bring an identical copy into the dream world. Hitoshi had loved it so much that he actually initiated a hug for once. After a few months of training, they both found that reflexes earned in the dreamscape correlated to the real world, which was awesome. It really helped with running from bullies and dodging blasts of fire. He did eventually tell Hitoshi that he didn't have a quirk, but the other boy had just tilted his head, nodded, and muttered, "That makes sense." In turn, Izuku had found out about Hitoshi's quirk, which was a form of hypnotism, though the boy called it brainwashing. Soon after, Izuku found out that when he wasn't imagining the other boy, Hitoshi went to school and got bullied just like Izuku did, even though his quirk was super cool. Izuku wondered if that was his subconscious at work, making his imaginary friend someone who was just like him. Either way, he was glad Hitoshi had a place to exist when Izuku couldn't be with him. Otherwise, it would probably be unbearably lonely. He told Hitoshi that he had bullies too, but the other boy had seemed more annoyed than comforted. Another thing Izuku found out about his new friend: he loved cats. Like really loved cats. As soon as he found out he was able to, Hitoshi began to fill the dreamscape with cats every time he arrived. When he wasn't training or playing, he could often be found buried under a pile of them, or chasing one around, or just sitting with one on his lap. It got the point where, after a few months of Hitoshi spending more time with the cats than Izuku, he had resort to drastic measures. Which in this case meant giving himself cat ears and a tail and plopping himself in front of his friend. When Hitoshi didn't look up immediately, Izuku had even done the cute wide-eyed look that usually made teachers go easier on him, curled his fingers to look like a paw, and said, "Naya." Hitoshi had turned a bright cherry red, to the point where Izuku was worried he was going to pass out. But instead the other boy had just covered his face with his hands and hurriedly promised to spend more time with him, and then made him promise never to do it again. Izuku did, but crossed his fingers behind his back while doing so. It always paid to have a trump card. It was then that Izuku realized that while he had thought of the other boy as a little cold at first, In reality, it just seemed like he was more used to interacting with cats than people. Once he began learning how cats communicated, he saw a lot of the same behavior in Hitoshi. Unfortunately, he found himself unintentionally picking up on those same mannerisms, to the point where he once caught himself curled up in his mom's lap, nuzzling her hand. Without meaning to, he began to distance himself from his mom, vastly preferring Hitoshi's warm eyes and soft pets to her suffocating hugs that always seemed to press right against a burn or a bruise. In fact, if it weren't for his hero training, Izuku thought he probably would have spent all of his time in his dreamscape. But as much as Izuku changed, becoming more distant and a bit sarcastic, Hitoshi did too, though he became warmer and a little more genuine. But even as they became more similar, the two remained undeniably opposites. Hitoshi was cynical, snappy, and much better at stealth and trickery. Izuku, on the other hand, was hopeful, earnest, and more well-versed in hand-to-hand combat and head-on fighting. Hitoshi wanted to be an underground hero, and Izuku wanted to go daylight. Izuku liked it. He thought they balanced each other out nicely. And just like that, 7 years passed. Now 14, the results of his training were showing clearly. In fact, on one occasion, Izuku had scored higher than Bakugo on an endurance test, and the other boy had demanded Izuku be tested for steroids. Even the gym teacher, who hated Izuku's guts, told him that they couldn't do that because this was a middle school and Izuku's results were perfectly within legal range. He got a shiny new scar that day, and a reminder to hold himself back in any class, including gym. Unfortunately, now that Bakugo had gotten a glimpse of how strong Izuku was, he began to get sad if Izuku scored too low, yelling something about Izuku looking down on him or something. It was incredibly stupid, but in the end what it meant was that the beatings got worse. And then, one warm spring day, the first friend he had ever had told him to throw himself off of a roof. Izuku had stared at him incredulously, and by the time his brain caught up with him and he got sad, Bakugo had already left. Izuku stormed back home in a huff, already imagining the expression Toshi would make when he told him. Only for him to be caught by a villain and nearly drowned by sentient sludge. If he had normal dreams, he was pretty sure that would have shown up in his nightmares. Luckily, a hero came along and saved him. Holy shit, that's All Might dash. Damn. By this time, Izuku had enough practice hiding his emotions that he didn't totally lose his shit the second he saw the hero. He tried to stop All Might to ask him a question, but the man had jumped away before he could, and Izuku realized at the last second that it would be a stupid idea to try and grab him. So he just continued on his walk towards home, faith in his own heroic potential rattled by how helpless he had been when faced with a real villain. He had always had doubts about whether or not he could be a hero. It was impossible not to when the only person who told you could was your imaginary friend, but he hadn't felt quite this hopeless about it in a long time. For the billionth time, Izuku wished Hitoshi was real, or at least that he could imagine him during the day as well. But he couldn't, so instead he trudged home. There was a villain attack along the way, but for once Izuku didn't want to stop to look at it. One of the heroes was yelling something about how the villain had a hostage, so it would be better to stay out of a delicate situation like that. Hold on. Izuku paused mid-step. It was the same villain from earlier. But that couldn't be right. All Might had arrested him. And All Might wasn't on the scene now, so... Izuku hesitated, his curiosity warring with his urge to just go home and sleep. Finally, he decided that it would be nice to have another thing to talk about with Hitoshi, so he pushed through the crowd, wincing at the familiar scent of smoke and the pop-pop-pop sound of tiny explosions. Only to look up and lock eyes with Bakugo. He stood frozen for a second, staring at his bully, until a wave of irrational anger overtook him. Because of all people, it just had to be Bakugo trapped by a villain, looking at him wide, desperate eyes that screamed, "Please help me." If Izuku was a little more optimistic, he might have thought to wait for a hero with a better quirk to get there. If he was a little smarter, he would have made a plan. If he was a little less bitter, he wouldn't have hesitated, wouldn't have considered just standing by and doing nothing. But he did hesitate, and Bakugo saw it. And in that moment, Izuku quite suddenly remembered that Bakugo was a child. Yeah, he was a spoiled bully with an ego the size of an airplane, but he was just 14. And even if Izuku thought he could stand to be knocked down a peg, he never wished for something like this. So when he saw Bakugo's terrified eyes slide closed in resignation, his feet moved before he could think. It was only after he started moving that he tried to think of a plan, which didn't give him a lot of time. Since the first year of middle school, Izuku had begun carrying a pocket knife with him at Hitoshi's suggestion. It was a tiny thing, something that he could realistically say he forgot was in his pocket in case he got caught with it at school, but it made him feel just a bit safer. As he ran, Izuku shrugged off his backpack and pulled out the knife, ignoring the cries from behind him. Bakugo looked up at the sudden increase of noise, eyes widening when he saw Izuku approach. The villain recognized him too, started yelling something about useless kids or whatever, but Izuku just jumped up and stabbed the guy in the eye. The villain recoiled, screaming. It gave Izuku enough room to drag Bakugo halfway out of the sludge, grab his wrist, and point his palm towards the villain. He probably yelled something like, "Blast him, you idiot." But to be honest, he didn't really remember through the haze of adrenaline. Bakugo bared his teeth and yelled something back, insults, probably, but did as he asked, releasing a panicked explosion big enough to fry the villain and send them flying back towards the heroes. Unfortunately, the villain was made of liquid, so while the blast definitely hurt, it didn't incapacitate him. The heroes quickly stepped between Bakugo and the now much slower villain, and after just a minute or so they were able to apprehend him. A tall, vaguely sick-looking old man gave them 2 soda bottles to put the villain in, and Izuku privately thought that heroes should really diversify their methods of villain apprehension. And then Bakugo yelled about not wanting help from a quirkless loser, which made Death Arms start to yell at him for being reckless or something. Izuku quickly began to zone out, having long since become adept at tuning out unfair scoldings and hissed insults. He idly wondered if Eraserhead would have been able to capture the villain, since his capture scarf probably wouldn't have worked. Then again, maybe he had other forms of support equipment. Once the hero was done yelling, Izuku tuned back in just in time to slip away from an insistent paramedic. He was already having a terrible day, and he really didn't want to end it off with being sent to the hospital for all those scars he had that weren't on his medical records. Bakugo tried to follow him, but Izuku was not in the mood to entertain his inferiority complex, so he slipped away from him too. And then, because the universe is awfully fond of threes, a tall old man stopped him on the way home. Izuku was immediately on guard, hand slipping into the pocket with the knife in it as he got ready to run, only for the man to puff up and turn into All Might. At first, Izuku had assumed that this person had a transformation or illusion type quirk, and was pretending to be All Might to gain his trust. Bakugo had yelled about him being quirkless, and both Hitoshi and his mom had warned him about human traffickers that targeted quirkless people. But the way the man almost instantly deflated and began coughing up blood discredited that theory somewhat. Supposedly, the man was All Might himself, and he simply had a strength quirk that was sort of like flexing. He said that ever since receiving a bad injury 5 years ago, he had been slowly running out of time in that form, which is why he had been in such a hurry earlier. Izuku hadn't really had time to think about it, but it kind of sunk in right then that All Might had left him, a 14-year-old, alone and unchecked by paramedics after a near-death experience. So now he was mostly convinced that this person was actually All Might, but now he wasn't sure that All Might was actually a good person. The hero had launched into a dramatic speech about how Izuku had the heart of a hero, and was super brave, and how noble it was of him to throw himself into danger for his friend. If he had heard those words from this man a day ago, Izuku would have been ecstatic. As it was, he had simply gotten more and more angry with each word, until the man unwittingly confessed that he had been watching the attack and doing nothing, and Izuku felt his anger boil over. "We're not friends," he said, cutting off the hero's rant. All Might faltered at his icy tone. "My boy," he said, sounding concerned. "Bakugo and I aren't friends." Izuku repeated. "Quirkless people don't get friends. He's a bully who puts people down for fun." He raised his arm so the sleeve slid down, showing a shiny hand-shaped burn scars wrapped around his wrist. "He's put me in the hospital 3 times, and no one has ever done anything about it, no matter who I tell. So, save the speeches, All Might, and tell me. What could you possibly want from someone like me?" All Might looked stunned at his confession, and then his expression softened. "If he's been so cruel to you, then why did you help him?" He asked gently. Why not just leave him to his fate? Izuku ducked his head and dug his hands into the straps of his backpack. I thought about it. Izuku said quietly. He told me to throw myself off of a roof today. So at first I thought that it was karma, that he would get caught up with a villain and feel just as helpless as he always made me feel. But that was because there were heroes on the scene, and he was fighting, and I thought he was going to be fine in the end. And then the heroes weren't doing anything, and he looked at me, and he looked so scared. Even if he would never admit it in that moment, his eyes looked like they were asking for help. And my body just moved before I could even think about it. Because I could still feel it, the villain in my throat. Could still remember how it felt to drown, could remember how terrified I had been, thinking I was going to die alone in an underpass at 14, and I hate Bakugo, and I think I always will, but he doesn't, no one deserves that. His voice had gotten quieter towards the end, until he was whispering and blinking back tears. My boy, All Might said warmly, and Izuku looked up to meet his gaze. That means that you have the heart of a hero, in the original sense of the word. That means that you are brave and compassionate to answer when someone calls for help, no matter who it is and no matter the odds. Seriously? Izuku thought with more than a little disgust. I just told you I was terrified of dying, and you said, good job risking your life? What the hell kind of logic is that? And those are exactly the qualities I am looking for. You see, I am searching for a successor. What? Izuku breathed. But I'm quirkless? All Might laughed boisterously and leaned down to wink at him. Not to worry, the hero said, grinning. We can fix that. Izuku had always loved quirks, which led to the unfortunate side effect of always hating that he didn't have one. It made him feel so boring. But being quirkless was a part of who he was. It was something his identity was built around, whether he liked it or not. And the idea that All Might could take that away from him? It filled him with bone-deep terror. It. He croaked, his hands shaking by his sides. Now, I know that sounds unbelievable, All Might began, looking pleased with himself. But trust me, it's the truth. You see, my quirk is not a strength enhancement quirk at all, like many assume. In reality, it's actually an energy stockpiling quirk that can be passed down from person to person. With my power, you, too, can be a hero. Izuku stared at All Might in utter shock for a moment. He had a bizarre surreal feeling, and he wondered if this is what normal people felt like when they dreamed. Like nothing that was happening made sense, but it was happening anyways. Can I get arrested for punching a pro hero? He thought. And then all of his emotions came rushing back in a flurry of disdain and anger. He can't be FING serious. This is what for red flags? All in one conversation. And then, quite suddenly, he had a very different thought. I can use this. Izuku was fairly confident that even without a quirk he could become a decent hero. But even he knew that his dream of going above ground and changing people's opinions about quirkless people was naive at best, suicidal at worst. In the end, he would probably have to settle for going underground. Which would still be awesome. He was 100% sure he would rather be an underground hero than not a hero at all. But part of the appeal of hero work was the recognition, the idea of making people feel safe with nothing but a smile. And that wasn't realistic for a quirkless person. But despite how often he had wished for a quirk, now that the opportunity was in front of him. Scary, he thought, shaking like a leaf. Scary, 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 what do I do? Try to trick All Might. This is way too much. But I can't just let this opportunity pass me by. What should I do? What's the correction option? Will he get mad if I say no? What if I say yes and he asks for something bad in exchange? What do I do? What's the right choice? What do I do? What would Toshi do? That thought calmed him down somewhat. Right, Hitoshi would know what to do. Even if he plays it off as a joke at first, he usually had pretty good advice. I just have to get home and sleep and then ask Hitoshi. But first he had to get away from All Might without making the hero suspicious. Sir, he breathed, looking up with an expression of wonder as he subtly slipped his hand into the pocket with the knife. A move like that wouldn't have gotten past any other pro hero, but All Might didn't even blink at the motion. That's wow. I don't even know what to say. I never even imagined. He paused, wondering if he was laying it on too thick, but the hero just kept looking at him with that same wide smile. Hesitantly, Izuku continued. It's just that. It's such a big decision. Can I have some time to think about it? He winced as his voice cracked, and then went rigid with fear as the hero seemed to sag in disappointment. I won't tell anyone, I promise. And, I can give you my number so. He hurried to add, and then trailed off, shifting his stance so his feet pointed away from Hiro. Of course, my boy. All Might said, and though disappointment was clear in his tone, he didn't sound angry, and his posture didn't shift into anything threatening. In fact, he looked more sheepish than anything as he reached up to scratch his cheek. Yes, I got a bit too excited. I'll give you my number, just don't go sharing it with your friends, alright. He winked as he pulled out a pen and grabbed Izuku's hand. He stifled a flinch before writing a phone number on the back. Pretending he wasn't terrified of how easy it would be for the hero to crush his hand in his grip, Izuku simply looked up at him with a delighted, nervous expression. Is this really okay? He squeaked. I mean, wow, you're All Might dash. And you don't even know my name? All Might blushed, looking away in embarrassment. Oh well, that other boy called you Deku, didn't he? The hero looked at him hopefully, and Izuku had to squash the urge to glare at him. Instead he just let his gaze fall, slumping slightly in faux dismay. Why yeah, it's an insult. It means useless. Izuku mumbled, nudging the dirt with the toe of his shoe. All Might choked in surprise, and Izuku couldn't help but wince at the sight of blood. Yes, I suppose I should ask for your name, then? Izuku hesitated to give his real name, but only for a second. The man had already seen his face, after all, and his school uniform, and knew he was quirkless. With the resources of the number one hero, that was more than enough information to find him. No matter what, Izuku knew there was no running now. I'm Izuku Midoriya. It's a pleasure to meet you. He bowed a little too low, and the hero laughed loudly. It's a pleasure to meet you too, young Midoriya. If all this had happened before he became a little more bitter. No, if all of this had happened just a day ago, then Izuku would surely have been in tears from this one conversation. And yet, for some reason, when he heard his name come from All Might's mouth, it felt like a death sentence. I'm home. There was no response. Izuku hadn't been expecting one. He kicked off his shoes and closed the door behind him, letting his backpack slide to the floor as he collapsed on the couch. Phew-uck. He groaned, pressing his face into a pillow. What is my fucking life? He strongly considered just falling asleep there on the couch, but eventually decided it wasn't worth the worried look his mother would give him. He pulled himself up with a sigh, peeling off his uniform jacket. For today, he just had to put his stuff away, sweep, do his homework, make dinner, eat dinner once his mom got home, train, take a shower. And then he could sleep. He sighed again and got to work. About half an hour later, the doorbell rang. Izuku looked up with a frown from where he had been sweeping, straightening up and cracking his back. He glanced at the clock, confirming what he already knew, that his mother wouldn't be home for another few hours at least. Still though, he didn't question it much beyond the vague thought of that's weird before he walked over to the door and pulled it open, ready to ask what was wrong. Only to see Bakugo standing there. Izuku froze. To his surprise, the first thing he felt wasn't anger or confusion or even a vague, oh, great. No, it was concern. Because he and Katsuki had an unspoken agreement that they didn't go to each other's houses unless there was an emergency. The last time had been ages ago, when Bakugo accidentally started a fire in his house due to a quirk mishap and came running to them in a panic. The only other time they encroached on each other's territory was when their parents had dinner with each other, and those meetings were always set up days, if not weeks in advance. So when he saw Bakugo on his doorstep, head bowed and hands fisted at his sides, he didn't even stop to consider the danger he was in. Are you okay? Izuku asked. Instantly, he knew that was the wrong thing to say when Bakugo looked up at him in unbridled disbelief and anger. Am I okay? Katsuki repeated. Am I okay? What the hell is wrong with you? Izuku felt his eye twitch as his grip tightened on the doorknob. What's wrong with me? Izuku asked incredulously. You're the one who showed up at my house just to yell at me. Bakugo flinched and looked away. That's not, I didn't. Katsuki trailed off into muttering, glaring at the ground. Izuku took a deep breath, sent a prayer for patience. At this point, he didn't particularly care who answered, and tried his best to be polite. Okay, he said. So what did you need? Bakugo winced. He opened his mouth, hesitated, closed it again. Started shifting from foot to foot. Finally, when Izuku was just about to shut the door in his face, he spoke. You dash, Bakugo said, and then clenched his hands into fists and glared at the floor. You hesitated. He mumbled. It took Izuku a second to realize what he was talking about. When he did, he felt bitter indignation surge through him, and his grip on the door tightened enough that he thought he heard the wood creak. Oh, I'm sorry. Izuku hissed. Next time I'll try to be a little faster when I save your DMN life. That's dash. Bakugo visibly bit back an insult, gritting his teeth. That's not what I meant. I want to know. Why? Izuku stared at him incredulously for a long moment. He considered just closing the door and walking away. But that wouldn't do anything other than piss Katsuki off. So he took a deep breath, let out a long sigh, and began to roll up his sleeves. Bakugo blinked in surprise. What are you dash, he began, and then froze at the sight in front of him. Izuku kept his expression perfectly blank as he held out his scarred forearms. Congratulations, Bakugo. Izuku said icily. You're looking at 10 years of your own hard work. Bakugo flinched as the words landed like a blow, eyes widening in horror. You wouldn't know, because every time you see me they're either covered by the uniform or by bandages. You know, I got reminded of something today, when I saw you caught up with that sludge villain. We're 14, Bakugo. We're kids. Name one adult that you know who has as many scars as I do. Katsuki looked pale. His hands were shaking, and he kept glancing from Izuku's arms to his face and back again. Deku. He breathed. Izuku twitched, a scowl crossing his features as he yanked his sleeves back down. That's not my name. He snapped. Bakugo winced again. And you wondered why I could have possibly hesitated to put my life on the line for you. He grumbled sarcastically. Christ, Bakugo, you told me to kill myself today. You literally want me dead. Is it really so surprising that, just for a second, I might think about wanting the same for you? Evidently thus. Bakugo recoiled, taking a step back as his face went bone white. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, and for a second Izuku was worried that the other boy might vomit right on his front porch. Izuku. Bakugo choked out. Don't call me by my first name. Izuku said bluntly. We're not friends. Bakugo winced, and for a second he could have sworn he saw tears in the other boy's eyes. He brushed the thought away quickly. Bakugo wouldn't be caught dead crying in front of Deku. Izuku sighed and rubbed his face. Is that all you wanted? He asked finally. I don't want you dead. Bakugo whispered. Could have fooled me. Izuku said. And then he slammed the door in his face. It took Bakugo 3 minutes and 24 seconds to walk away. Izuku would know. He didn't move the entire time, just stood behind the door and listened with bated breath, only relaxing when the other boy finally left. He cast a longing glance at the couch, desperately wanting a nap, but shook off his mental fatigue. He had stuff to do after all. He did decide that he could skip training today, though, telling himself that going through 3 rounds of dealing with Bakugo was more than enough of an exercise. As usual, his day ended in a bit of a daze. He finished sweeping, did his homework, instinctively made sure he would only get around an 85%, cooked dinner, a simple dish of salmon and noodles, ate dinner with his mom once she got back, took a quick shower, changed into pajamas, and then collapsed into bed. And then his day really began. He let out a quiet sigh of relief as he opened his eyes in the dreamscape, already relaxing now that he knew he was in control here. He took a moment to think as he waved away his scars, which peeled off his skin and turned into butterflies that flew away. Izuku barely noticed it, already moving to set up a safe space. He wanted somewhere to hide, something as far removed from reality as possible. He flicked out a wrist and the white cube shifted, corners pulling in and walls pushing out as the whole thing turned a dim gray, until a stone cave too smooth to be natural had formed around him. It was a little too dark though, so he tapped the walls as he strode through the cave, and everywhere he had touched mushrooms that glowed a soft orange or blue burst forth from the rock. He twisted his hand into a claw and raised it, and soft moss that radiated a gentle heat stretched up from the ground. He added a nest of pillows, blankets, a weighted blanket, and finally an old cat that was perfectly content to cuddle all night. Then he spun in a circle, shifting his clothes from boring pajamas to a super fluffy oversized hoodie and a pair of soft shorts before diving into the pile. He curled up under blankets, clutching the cat to his chest and letting the warm moss soothe the tension from his muscles as he waited for Hitoshi to get there. As always, the other boy didn't take long. He popped into existence next to Izuku, shuddering slightly as he shook off the remnants of whatever nightmare he had been having. He stopped to look around, letting out a low whistle at the sight of the cave as he waved away his own injuries and scars. Hitoshi paused when his eyes landed on the pile of blankets, and he tilted his head. "You're here early," he said casually, though Izuku could hear a hint of concern in his tone that made his heart warm. He didn't respond, just lifted up one corner of the blanket, inviting the other boy in. Hitoshi huffed quietly but obeyed, crawling in with a happy hum at the warmth he found and cuddling into Izuku's side. "You all right?" he asked softly once he had settled down. Izuku said, feeling most of the tension drain from his body as he wriggled his arms to wrap around Hitoshi, pulling him close and squishing the cat between them slightly. It let out a happy purr though, so Izuku was pretty sure it was fine. "Long day. Tell me," Hitoshi asked, petting the cat and seeming not to notice how Izuku clung to him like a koala. Unlike with other people, Izuku didn't have to worry about bothering Hitoshi with his clinginess. The other boy always made it incredibly clear when he didn't want to be touched, and the lack of mind games and nonverbal cues was a massive relief to Izuku. He let out a quiet sigh, wiggling his fingers to fill the room with the gentle scent of lavender and fresh rain. "You first," Izuku said finally. "I don't want to think about it yet." "All right," Hitoshi said, noticeably more concerned now as he ran a gentle hand through Izuku's hair. "I threw a kid out a window today." Izuku choked on a startled laugh. "Jesus, Toshi," he said, letting a small smile rise to his face. "Who the hell starts a story like that?" "Got your attention, didn't it?" Hitoshi replied smugly. "Sides, he deserved it. He was messing with some other kid. Ito something." "Eito," Izuku corrected quietly. "The girl with the hair-growing quirk." Hitoshi let out a small, amused huff. Anyways, he spilled her lunch on the floor and told her to lick it up. "I told him if he wanted to see a dog so bad he should look in the mirror." Izuku giggled under his breath, and felt Hitoshi smile slightly in response. "He didn't like that. Tried to punch me. I hit him in the thigh, like how you showed me, and he went down hard. It was great. I ran away, of course. Was gonna lead him to a teacher, but he got up faster than I expected and caught up to me in the hallway. Stopped in front of an open window, the one above the pool, so I just kicked him. Went tumbling down, screaming like a baby." "That's amazing," Izuku said with a grin that quickly faded into worry. "You're okay though, right? You didn't get in trouble?" "Nah," Hitoshi mumbled, nuzzling against his hair. The cat purred louder. He said he tripped. Even threatened to sue the school for leaving a window so high up open like that without any safety measures. It's incredible how far people will go to avoid looking like an idiot. Tripping out an open window into a pool isn't exactly cool. Izuku replied sarcastically, rubbing the cat behind the ears. "Better than getting beaten up by a future villain." Hitoshi muttered darkly. Izuku just hummed into his shoulder, already used to his bitterness. "Don't worry," Izuku said, eyes drifting shut in a doze. "In 10 months, when you pass the entrance exam, they'll all be bragging that they got beat up by a future hero." Hitoshi didn't say anything, but Izuku heard the boy's breath hitch before he felt the arms around him squeeze gently. He took it as the silent thank you it was. "I got to see something nice." Hitoshi whispered, so quietly Izuku barely caught it. When he fell into the pool. The girl did. She laughed. Laughed like she wasn't afraid of being caught doing it anymore. It was nice to see. Yeah, Izuku mumbled, rubbing slow circles into Hitoshi's back in acknowledgement of the rare display of vulnerability. It is, isn't it? The two of them sat there for a long moment, enjoying the silence. Finally, Izuku spoke up again. You're lucky though. He muttered, looking up with a pout. You get all the grateful ones. Oh. Hitoshi asked in a teasing tone, raising an eyebrow. And who did our little knight in shining armor rescue today? Oi, Izuku said, kicking him in the shin. I'm not little, you freaking beanpole. Hitoshi hummed, smirking. Agree to disagree. Izuku kicked him again, but this time Hitoshi didn't respond, just waited for him to start talking. Izuku hesitated for a while. Opened his mouth and closed it again more than once. Eventually, he let out a low groan, resting his forehead against Hitoshi's sternum and rubbing the back of his neck. It's been a really long day. He mumbled. The cat mewed and liked his cheek, and he gave it a kiss on the forehead in turn. Hitoshi didn't say anything, but Izuku knew that he could choose to tell him everything or say nothing at all, and either way he would let it go. It was comforting to think about. Bakugo was unpleasant today. Izuku said finally. More unpleasant than usual? Hitoshi asked, and though his tone was teasing, his expression was concerned. Izuku nodded. Yeah, he mumbled. Yeah, we had to fill out our high school applications today. Hitoshi inhaled sharply. Oh. He breathed. Are you? No, he didn't really hurt me. Just threw a fit in the middle of class, and this time even the teacher told him to knock it off. But, after school, he came and found me and decided that I was looking down on him, or heroism, or something. By thinking that I could do it without a quirk? It's just, God, he's so stupid. Izuku glowered, squeezing the cat to avoid the urge to get up and start pacing. No kidding. Hitoshi grumbled, looking equally annoyed as he ran his fingers through Izuku's hair. The action calmed both of them down somewhat, and Izuku took a deep breath before he continued. And that wasn't even the worst of it. He told me not to apply to you or else, and then said that if I didn't like it, I should take a swan dive off a roof and hope for a quirk in my next life. Hitoshi went very, very still. For a second, Izuku thought he had even stopped breathing. His grip tightened on Izuku's hip and hair, where his hands lay, and Izuku could feel the boy begin to tremble slightly. What? Hitoshi snarled. Even though he knew the anger wasn't directed at him, Izuku couldn't help the way his heart lurched. Yeah. Izuku grumbled, quickly trying to move the story along. And then he just walked away. I know it shouldn't have surprised me so much, but... I don't know. I knew he hated me, but I kind of got the feeling that he was also scared of me sometimes. Or, I guess, scared of what I represented. Scared that the person he had considered an equal was suddenly at the bottom of the social ladder. So, I knew it was complicated, but I didn't think he wanted me to die. Hitoshi's grip tightened even further, but Izuku didn't mind. You couldn't get hurt or feel pain in dreams, after all. Still though, as soon as Hitoshi realized what he was doing, he quickly let go. Sorry. He mumbled, massaging the affected area soothingly. Izuku shook his head. Is fine. Izuku replied. No pain, remember? Hitoshi gave him an odd look. He did that sometimes, looked at Izuku like he was a puzzle. Izuku didn't mind that either. It was odd, but it made him feel important. Like Hitoshi truly wanted to see him for who he was at his core. That thought was a little too nerve-wracking, so he quickly moved the conversation on. And that wasn't even the end of my day. Izuku said with an exasperated eye roll. After that, I was walking home and got caught up in 2 villain attacks. You have the worst luck. Hitoshi said affectionately. Izuku huffed out a quiet laugh. Tell me about it. Izuku grumbled. Hitoshi waited patiently, but when Izuku didn't continue, he poked him in the side. So? Hitoshi asked. Which hero was it? Izuku felt his face twist into a glare as irritation surged up in him. All Might. He growled under his breath. Hitoshi straightened up. You met All Might? He asked incredulously, then paused when Izuku didn't react. You don't seem excited. Yeah. Izuku said, glaring down at his hands. I don't think he's my favorite hero anymore. Okay, Hitoshi said slowly. Do you want to tell me what happened? Izuku shrugged. Kind of did. But he also kind of didn't. He wanted to get it off his chest, but he also didn't want to admit to Hitoshi how useless he had been, despite how much the boy believed in him. Eventually, he shook his head. Nah, he muttered, ducking his head to rest on Hitoshi's chest. I don't want to think about it. Talk to me? Hitoshi obeyed without question. He rambled about a vigilante that had popped up in his area, about Eraserhead's latest arrest, about a stray cat that had let him pet it the other day. He talked about a cafe he found near his house that grew catnip outside it, though the owner seemed to not know that's what it was since they constantly complained about the stampede of strays. He brought up a movie about a man who didn't have a quirk, but instead found an alien that he convinced to pretend to be his quirk. By the end of it, Izuku felt significantly more relaxed, and the weight of the world didn't seem quite so crushing. Seriously, the human mind was amazing to be able to conjure up someone like this so easily. Toshi, he whispered once the boy paused. Yeah, Hitoshi asked. Would you? If someone told you they would give you everything you needed to become a hero, from strength to training to resources to connections, but you had to give up a huge part of yourself in exchange, would you do it? A huge part of myself, huh? Hitoshi mumbled thoughtfully. Like an arm? What? Izuku shook his head. No, he said. Like your quirk. And not just not use it. You'd have to completely destroy it. And they'd re-replace it with a different one. A more marketable one. He spat the word with disgust, to let his friend know for sure that Izuku thought his quirk was fine as is. Hitoshi let out a low whistle. Sheet. I don't know. A free pass like that would be incredible, but I like my quirk. And it would be a pain to relearn a whole new one. At that point, I might just become a vigilante, you know? Izuku giggled quietly. If I become a hero, I want to do it as I am, not as they want me to be. But I feel like if I rejected it and then didn't make it into the hero course, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. So, I dunno. In the end, I guess that if I thought I already had a decent chance at passing the exam, I'd decline. But if I thought there was no chance I could win, I'd probably agree. Izuku nodded slowly, shuffling around his thoughts to fit this new advice. Yeah. He said quietly. Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. Any particular reason you brought this up? Hitoshi asked, gently concerned. Izuku shook his head again. Just something I was thinking about. He mumbled, mentally calculating how likely it would be for him to be able to pass the entrance exam without a quirk. So far, he had been part of 2 villain attacks, one in which he was useless and the other in which he helped out. But in the end, they only survived the second time because Bakugo's quirk got them out of there. They would have been screwed without it. So, basically, Izuku's quirkless self had been useless in 100% of the villain attacks he had been in. And thus, his decision was made. Toshi, Izuku whispered again. Yeah. Hitoshi replied, nuzzling his hair. I'm gonna do something stupid. Well, don't get caught and don't go to jail. Hitoshi replied teasingly. He clearly expected Izuku's usual answer, which was an amused eye roll as he said it's not that kind of stupid. This time, he got something else entirely. I'll try, Izuku whispered. Hitoshi visibly did not like that, but he didn't seem to know what to say about it. Neither did Izuku, so neither of them said anything at all. They just sat together, dozing. You couldn't really sleep in dreams, that wouldn't make any sense, but you could very easily get sleepy. The cat dozed with them, not seeming to mind any form of squishing or cuddling they subjected it to. It was nice. It made Izuku slightly less terrified about the idea of manipulating a pro-hero into giving up his legacy. Then again, the man was practically a pile of red flags. Specifically offering to give his quirk to a kid that he knew was lonely, desperate, weak, and thought very little of their own life? And the way he had phrased it, like it was a great gift instead of a burden far too big for a 14-year-old. Izuku shuddered and shoved the thoughts away, instead choosing to ramble to Hitoshi about present mix radio station. The next morning when he woke up, he immediately wrote down a list of questions he had been coming up with all night. Then he sent off a text to the number 1 hero, set a meeting time, and prepared himself for the best performance of his career. He met All Might at a dirty old beach full of trash. Izuku sat down on a bench with him, pulled out the list of questions, and put on his most pitiful expression. Most of them they got through rather quickly, though some sent All Might off on tangents that Izuku had to gently guide him back from. He asked him about things from potential negative side effects of the quirk itself, exploded bones, what the F, to the enemies that might come with it, a 200-year-old supervillain that could steal quirks. But don't worry, he's definitely dead. No, I didn't find the body. Why do you ask? He sprinkled in some questions that he knew the hero would give a positive answer to, so that All Might didn't feel like Izuku was just dragging him. Honestly, Izuku was really proud of himself by the end. He was sure there were professional actors who would have done worse than him. Then again, maybe All Might was just naive enough not to notice Izuku's slip-ups. By the time he got to the last questions, and arguably the most dangerous one, he felt fairly confident. All Might, sir? He asked hesitantly, clutching his notebook to his chest and peering up through his eyelashes, the perfect picture of innocence. What if why you give it to me and then you find someone better? What if you change your mind? Izuku turned his gaze downwards, so he sounded exactly like the meek kid with no self-esteem All Might seemed to want him to be, as opposed to someone saying, hey, if I betray you, you can't take this back, right? Fortunately, it seemed to work, since All Might's expression softened and he ruffled Izuku's hair, which Izuku forced himself to sit still for. My boy, All Might said gently. My quirk is yours should you choose to accept it. Once you have it, no one can take it away from you. Not even me. He winked, like it was a little joke and not the exact answer Izuku had been hoping for. He very nearly burst into incredulous laughter. Seriously, how had All Might survived as the number 1 hero for this long and still remained so incredibly naive? He quickly ducked his head, pressing a hand to his mouth to hide his laughter, and by the time he looked up his eyes were shiny with fake tears and it seemed as though he had been holding back sobs instead. All Might, Izuku said quietly, putting on his best reverent fanboy expression. I would be honored to be your successor. Please take care of B. He bowed quickly, hiding his face behind his notebook so the hero wouldn't see his victorious, delighted grin. After that, the days seemed to pass quickly. They had 10 months until the UA entrance exam, though Izuku had also applied for Shiketsu just in case. All Might gave him a diet plan and a workout plan, and Izuku was pleased to see that they actually looked fairly good. Intense, but not borderline suicidal like Izuku had half expected. Although he did have to point out that it would probably be a good idea to add combat training, which luckily All Might seemed more embarrassed than offended by. The diet plan was easy to follow though, because if Izuku wanted junk food he could just eat it in his dream world. Of course, it had to be a food he had memorized the taste and texture of, or else it would feel like static in his mouth. According to All Might, Izuku had been ready for the quirk 2 months in. But with the threat of loss of limbs on his mind, he pushed it back to 4 months just to be sure. And boy was he glad he did. The demon quirk felt like a flood of battery acid in his veins, tearing up his muscles. He didn't even try to fully activate it until nearly a week after getting it. It was without a doubt too strong for his body, so he just spent most of a week struggling to let an ocean's worth of power drip through a faucet. Eventually, he realized the problem. He had been unintentionally thinking of the quirk as a ball of power right behind his sternum, but that wasn't true at all. It wasn't like the quirk was an organ with a specific location, it was in his very DNA. So while he had been trying to draw a line of power from his chest to his arm, he had actually just been condensing a whole 200 years worth of power in his arm. Now what the hell was he supposed to do about it? Oddly enough, it wasn't any of the quirk analysis sites he was on that helped him. In fact, it wasn't quirk-related at all. It was a video of a crazy 14-year-old girl with pink hair cackling as she ranted about setting her babies on fire. Apparently she was aiming for the UA support course and was logging her journey. Her channel wasn't very popular, and Izuku could understand why. She was very enthusiastic about her work, rambling and gesturing wildly, but Izuku liked that about her. And, if you were able to decipher her shorthand and random tangents, it quickly became obvious that she was incredibly smart. And also really funny, but that was neither here nor there. So one day, he had one of her videos playing in the background while he was doing homework, when he heard something that caught his attention. Too much power, it'll set the fabric on freaking fire. He paused, grabbed his phone, and rewound the video by about 30 seconds. She was currently trying to make a hoodie that had an electrical current running through it, to discourage touchy people, but was having problems with putting too much power in one spot. Which sounded just a bit familiar. Okay, watch. Look, I press the button, the electricity goes through, no fire. But over here on this bit, there is fire. So I was like, what the F is up with that? It's the same material, same battery, what the hell? But then I pulled this thing up, and I realized that I forgot to account for the seam lines when I was doing wire distribution. And obviously, if you use too much power, it'll set the freaking fabric on fire. But that's only if all the power is in one spot. See, because look, when the seam lines touch, there's more wires, which means more electricity, which means more fire. And that's bad. But over here, on the flat part, the wires are all spread out, and so no fire. So now I just have to go through by hand and thin out the wires in the seam lines, but I don't want to do that, so I'm giving up on this project. For the next one, rocket boots. There's this really old hero. Izuku sat there for a moment, shocked. And then he quickly scrambled to his feet and bolted out the door, calling out a swift goodbye for his mom as he ran to the trash beach he had been using for Quirk training under the guise of telling All Might he was cleaning it. He sat down in a small clearing of sand in the middle of the trash heap, taking deep breaths and clearing his mind. He reached for his quirk, and like always, it eagerly reached back. Instead of cramming it into one of his limbs, he just continued to breathe, letting it settle throughout his body. If he had to describe it, maybe something like letting the ocean of power wash through him? It kind of hurt, but they were barely tiny twinges of pain. Nothing compared to the raw tearing sensation that he had before. Right then, it had a particularly cheerful thrum to it. Move, the quirk seemed to whisper. Get up, move, run, fight, dash. Not yet. Izuku scolded, and then realized he was talking to himself. He held onto the quirk for as long as he could, a solid 10 minutes, before letting go and doubling over with gasps. He let out a tiny breathless giggle and experimentally stretched. He had a few aches, but nothing worse than what came after his usual workout, which was a vast improvement. He very nearly ran to All Might right then, just so he could brag to someone about it, but the hero didn't seem to understand the more conceptual breakthroughs Izuku had. He did better with hard evidence of improvement. For FS sake, the hero's advice to him for how to activate the demon quirk was, clench your butt and yell smash. Izuku was 100% sure that if he followed that advice, the only thing that would smash were his limbs. So Izuku plopped himself in the sand and practiced calling on his quirk, over and over until there was no pain. Then he started moving with it activated, first just standing up, then walking, then running. He didn't put any power into his movements, despite how the quirk seemed desperate to run. If Bakugo's quirk was always screaming to be used like this, Izuku could almost understand why he was such a J. Just like he had hoped, he found regulating how much power he used was much easier when the energy was spread out like that. Practically vibrating with nerves, he then moved on to calling as little of it as possible, decided that was 1%, aiming his hand out towards the ocean, and flicking one finger. The force of the blast carved a divot in the water and sent Izuku stumbling backwards, tiny pinpricks of pain sparking in his finger as he landed on his butt. He had then nearly gotten arrested, having forgotten that technically public quirk use was a crime, and having enough bad luck that a cop was walking by. Luckily, Izuku's ID still said quirkless, so he played up how dazed he was and pretended it was a very late manifestation. His ID checked out, and he hadn't technically been doing anything else illegal. The excuse of cleaning up the beach seemed to win him brownie points with the cop, so the man just sighed and handed back his ID, congratulating him before letting him know he should get that registered sooner rather than later. Which led him to his next problem. He needed a legal guardian's signature to update his quirk registration, and he hadn't told his mom that he had a quirk yet. The two of them had been slowly drifting apart ever since Izuku had imagined Hitoshi, and the other boy had convinced him to try and talk to her about how much she was limiting his life. Hadn't been receptive to it. Sometimes, Izuku thought it would be easier if she just hated him. Then he could hate her back, and they could avoid each other, and it would be fine. The way things were now, it was just uncomfortable. When he finally worked up the courage to tell her that he had a quirk now, she had given him the most disappointed, pitying expression he had ever seen. It made his quirk writhe in his gut, so he let it loose, just enough to show her the bright green sparks. She dropped a cup in surprise, and then burst into tears so relieved it made Izuku want to scream. In the end, it was for the better, because she took him to get his quirk registered without a fuss and toned down her smothering. Honestly, with her and Bakugo isolating him, was it any surprise that the only friend he had was one he found in his dreams? Speaking of which, Bakugo was leaving him alone these days. Other kids took his place, unwilling to let the quirkless kid go unbullied, but their quirks weren't nearly as painful as Bakugo's, so it wasn't that bad. He never told his school about the update in the quirk registry, even though he was technically legally required to. He really didn't want to watch their attitudes do a complete 180 just because he had a quirk now. He might actually snap and punch someone if that happened. He didn't tell Hitoshi about his new quirk either, and he explained away his new combat skills by saying his mom had signed him up for self-defense classes. Quite honestly, the whole mess was weird and complicated, and he didn't want to ruin their time together by whining about it all the time. He just wanted a space where he didn't have to think about any of it. Mostly, though, he didn't know how Hitoshi would react, and he wouldn't risk their time together for anything. No matter how pathetic he felt for lying to his imaginary friend. Hitoshi definitely noticed something was wrong. He gave Izuku a lot more of those concerned examining looks than before. But he didn't say anything, which Izuku was grateful for. Just let him take the lead in their combat training, and worked extra hard to keep up. Izuku met with All Might 2 or 3 times a week, though they spent almost all their time training and hardly ever talked about anything other than One for All or hero work. On one occasion, Izuku asked why All Might was in the area in the first place, since his usual patrol was pretty far from here, and nearly spat out his drink when the hero confessed that he was going to teach at UA in the coming year. He managed to convince him that it was a bad idea to teach without a teaching license. "You told me that there's no shaming in not knowing how to do something, sir, you just have to learn it." While trying to figure out a way to convince the hero to quit the job. He really did not want to have to put on this starry-eyed fanboy act every day for 3 years. Luckily, when he asked why the hero chose to teach at UA if he didn't even want to get a license, though more politely than that, the man said that he had been planning on looking for a successor, which gave Izuku the perfect opportunity to employ a good old-fashioned guilt trip. He made a show of flinching, hunching his shoulders and ducking his head, staring resolutely at the floor as he mumbled about how it was probably a good idea to do it then, in case Izuku wasn't good enough, and let the hero. Predictably, All Might panicked, and Izuku was able to corner him into giving up on the job, to his relief. He did feel kind of bad about it, though. The more he got to know All Might, the more he began to realize that the hero wasn't really a bad person. He wasn't cruel or vindictive or anything, he was just kind of an idiot. He was hopelessly naive, and seemed incapable of thinking about the consequences of his actions despite being a hero for most of his life. He also seemed to be a bit lonely, was extremely self-sacrificial, and had an incredibly skewed sense of danger, all of which seemed to be because he was a hero for most of his life. It was actually rather interesting to talk to him sometimes, like a psychology study, about what being a symbol of peace could do to someone. By the time the entrance exam rolled around, Izuku felt good about his chances. He could use a solid 10% of One for All now, and was able to bounce off walls like a toddler on a sugar high, another thing that had been inspired by the pink-haired girl. This time, he remembered to leave a comment on her video thanking her for it, letting her know that she had really helped him figure out his quirk. She didn't reply, but Izuku didn't particularly mind. It's the thought that counts, or something. He hadn't exactly had a chance to completely let loose with his power, so he wasn't sure how far he could go, but he still felt like the odds were in his favor. The night before the entrance exam, he spent all night with Hitoshi, alternating between planning, hyping each other up, and trying not to think about it. The next day he woke up a little too early and had to wait around in his room for a while, but then waited too long and had to run all the way there, which meant that he wasn't paying attention, so he tripped at the gate. Luckily, he was caught by a nice girl with a zero-gravity quirk, and Izuku managed to stammer out a thank you before bolting inside. He was pretty sure he did well on the written test, though he had to remind himself to tone down the hero bashing during the more morality-based questions. While listening to the explanation of the physical exam, Izuku thanked his lucky stars that Bakugo was placed in a different test site than him. That wouldn't have ended well. He was a little floored when he heard that they would be fighting tons of giant freaking robots, and he instinctively worried that Hitoshi might not do well, but then remembered that the boy wasn't real and so wouldn't be taking the test. That thought kinda bummed him out, and it was only made worse by a kid with glasses calling him out for mumbling. Izuku apologized, but not without shooting him a glare. When he saw the nice girl again outside the test site, Izuku tried to thank her, but was interrupted by the boy with glasses once again. Izuku had to take a moment to recover from suddenly being touched from behind, and then had to bite his tongue when the people around him began muttering about having one less person to worry about. Seriously, what the hell had he done to get so many people's attention already? His nerves made his quirk buzz through him, so the second the door opened he was off like a rocket, tearing robots apart with his bare hands. Except, ow, that really hurt. He made a mental note to ask for hand protection on his hero costume as he bounced up the side of a building. He stood on the roof for a moment, looking around to see where the most robots were as he took off his jacket and tore strips of fabric off of it, winding those around his knuckles and fingers to protect them. Unfortunately, those also didn't do much, and he had to switch halfway through to a more kick-based fighting style, which he wasn't as used to. Along the way he made sure to keep an eye out for other kids that might need help, knowing all too well how easy it was to freeze up in your first fight. Really, you'd think at least one of the people in charge of this nightmare might look at this and go, hey, this might be too dangerous for a group of 14 to 15-year-olds. Izuku thought, shaking his head as he picked a piece of rubble up off of a boy with electric yellow hair and slammed it through a robot. The boy seemed dazed, but when Izuku tried to check for head wounds the boy blushed and quickly assured him it was a side effect of his quirk. He wouldn't let Izuku lead him to somewhere safe either, intent on finishing the exam, so Izuku just shrugged and bounced away in a flurry of green lightning. He didn't count how many points he got, too lost in the utter joy of being able to let loose. One for all roared through him like it never had before, and it took quite a bit of effort to restrain himself from just going completely feral and tearing every robot apart as fast as possible. He had to be strategic about it, try not to get any other kids caught up in the flying robot bits. Still though, the entire time he was fighting, he grinned so widely he probably looked insane, and it certainly wasn't helped by the blood dripping from his split knuckles. And then he came across the zero-pointer. Or rather, the zero-pointer came out of the ground in front of him. He stood there for a moment, trying to decide if it was worth it to see if he could take it down, since by this point the adrenaline was starting to fade and he could tell that his hands were broken in several places, his feet and legs bruised all to hell, and the rest of his body was starting to ache and twinge from pouring one for all through it for so long. He had just decided it wasn't worth risking permanent damage when he heard it. Ow! Izuku's head whipped around at the sound. There, lying under the rubble, was the nice girl from earlier. Izuku blinked, and then suddenly he was halfway in the air, flying towards the zero-pointer's head. Cursing his stupid body for moving without his permission again, he slammed into its face, scrabbling for a second. Before he sent one for all through his fingers and tightened his grip, forcing handholds into the metal. Quickly, he pulled one fist back and slammed it through the big camera in the middle of its faceplate, letting out a small yelp of pain as glass and metal shards dug into his hand and forearm. He grabbed the inside of the plate and yanked to the side, tearing open a hole in the metal big enough for him to wiggle his torso inside and begin tearing at the wiring and circuitry. Ow dash ow dash. Sheet, that hurts dash. Izuku hissed as bits of metal dug into his arms and stomach, and the wires shot off sparks that burnt his skin. Within seconds, the LEDs inside its head blinked off as the machine lumbered to a stop. Izuku wriggled himself back out, taking a deep breath of fresh air as jerked backwards, and began tumbling back into open air, the blood on his hands having made his grip slippery. "Oh F!" he yelped, twisting in midair to kick off the side of the robot, trying to reach the roof of a building, but falling just shy of it. He twisted again, pulling his fist back, thinking that maybe he could cancel out gravity with a well-timed blast. A hand struck his cheek, and Izuku bobbed in midair for a moment, stunned. "Ah, release," the nice girl said weakly, tapping her fingertips together. Instantly Izuku fell to the ground, letting out another yelp as the movement jostled his injuries. The girl turned and threw up, but Izuku barely heard it because he was still staring at the sky in a daze. "Holy shit," he whispered, and then burst into hysterical giggles as he sat up. "Oh my god, did you see that?" "Are you okay?" the girl asked, voice wobbling. "Am I okay?" Izuku said incredulously, still laughing. "Are you kidding? This is the best day of my life." The girl's jaw dropped as she stared at him. You nearly died." "Yeah, wasn't it great?" He giggled breathlessly, ignoring the pain in his legs, which probably came from when he leapt at the 0p. He must have put too much power into his jump. As he got to his feet, he sent her a lopsided grin. "I mean, I punched a giant robot in the face. It really doesn't get any cooler than that, huh?" "Wow," she said, staring at him. Really an optimist, huh?" "Optimist," Izuku repeated, tilting his head slightly. "Nah, I don't think so. If I had to say, maybe something more like adrenaline junkie?" He beamed at her, and she ducked her head and began to laugh incredulously. "Well," she said, wiping a tear from her eye, "at least you're honest." Izuku laughed again, for once not caring about how weird he looked or what social cues he was missing or what the girl might think of him. He just laughed, and let himself revel in the happy hum of his quirk and the feeling of sunlight on his skin. Recovery Girl wobbled up to them after a moment, and then whacked him on the head when he cheerfully gave her a rundown of his many, many injuries. Everything from scrapes, cuts, burns, bruises, fractures, lacerations, his mangled hands, and a pretty nasty case of quirk overuse. The nice girl blanched as he listed them all, and he quickly assured her that most of that had been acquired before he went toe-to-toe with a low-budget Mechagodzilla. Apparently, he needed a bit of surgery to deal with his hands. Not a huge amount, and since the injury had occurred on UA campus, during a UA exercise, the school was legally obligated to pay for his medical bills. So that was one less thing to worry about. His mom kicked up a fuss over him, of course, worrying over his casts. Izuku smiled and let her, gritting his teeth the whole time. Honestly, he loved his mom, but did she really need to scold him for 3 hours? So, by the time he got home, he was really eager to sleep. Luckily, his mom let him. He collapsed into bed and was out like a light, jerked away into the dreamscape. He automatically waved away his injuries and then began dancing about, setting up a small grass field with flowers and a picnic blanket and a vast spread of food. He threw his arms up and summoned a wide blue sky, filled with fluffy white clouds and warm, cheerful sun. Just then, he heard the familiar pop of Hitoshi appearing, and Izuku turned to him with a grin. "Toshi!" he chirped. "Howdy dash." Hitoshi immediately summoned a blanket, 3 cats, and a pillow and dropped to the floor, yanking the blanket over himself. Izuku paused, waved away the sun and dimmed the sky slightly into a more neutral blue. "Hey, Hitoshi," Izuku said quietly, moving to sit next to him. "What's wrong?" "Bombed it," Hitoshi mumbled, lifting the blanket. Izuku obediently wiggled under it as usual. "Bombed what?" he asked, wrapping his arms around his friend as the cats settled around them. "Exam," Hitoshi said. Izuku felt his breath catch. "Oh," he breathed. It made sense. If Hitoshi had done well on the exam and then not shown up at UA, he didn't know what his subconscious would do to try and fix that discrepancy. The only option was to have him not get in at all. And yet, Izuku had been training with him for this for half their lives. "I'm sorry," Izuku whispered, feeling horribly guilty. For the first time in his life, he half wished he had never imagined Hitoshi in the first place. Hitoshi didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't. He just cuddled into Izuku, ducking his head as his shoulders shook. "Robots," Hitoshi muttered, voice thick. Why, don't know why I expected anything else. Course it's robots. Why not, as if everything else isn't biased enough already. Izuku hummed agreeably, running his hands up and down his friend's back soothingly. He felt even more guilty now for enjoying the test so much when Hitoshi had been struggling so hard. Or, hadn't. Sheet, this whole imaginary friend thing was way more difficult than he had expected. Talk to me. Hitoshi asked quietly, and Izuku could hear the wobble in his voice that said that he was near tears. Please. Sure. Izuku said immediately. I made a friend today. Or, I think I did. I didn't get her name, but she have a zero-gravity quirk, and she helped me out when I was about to trip and fall. Actually, she helped me out of a fall twice. And then I think she gave me a compliment? She called me an optimist, at least. I didn't get her name, but she was nice. Sort of. Round-looking? Squishy. Like you. Hitoshi mumbled. Izuku rolled his eyes. Ha. Very funny. Let's see. There was this other kid, he had glasses and was very loud, but he also scolded me for mumbling like a hypocrite. He had some sort of speed quirk. There was also this boy who... Izuku rambled on about all the quirks he could think of, only pausing every now and then to reply to one of Hitoshi's sarcastic remarks. Hitoshi didn't ask how he had done, and Izuku didn't offer. He just sat and babbled and held his friend. Something similar happened on the day his acceptance letter arrived. It was a hologram that popped out to show Present Mike talking about his score, 74 villain points, and then added that there was something called rescue points, which he had received 63 of. That left him with 137 total points, which Present Mike enthusiastically informed him was the best score in UA history. Even better than freaking All Might. He had done incredibly well on the written exam too, not record-breaking or anything, but far better than average. And, even better, the nice girl had tried to give him some of her points when she found out how injured he got. Which meant that Izuku, little Deku of all people, had inspired someone enough that they would risk their career for him. He cried so hard he nearly couldn't breathe, and then sent All Might a message rambling about it. The hero offered to meet up with him that day, but Izuku didn't want to ruin his good mood, so he made up a lie about celebrating with his mom and then hopped into bed, eager to meet Hitoshi. For once, the boy was already there, and already under a huge pile of blankets. All thoughts of celebrating left him immediately as he hurried over to comfort his friend. Apparently, Hitoshi had gotten 7 villain points and 30 rescue points. Just barely not enough to make it into the hero course. For the first time in years, Hitoshi cried, clinging to Izuku desperately. And Izuku could do nothing but hold him and promised to himself that he would find a way to change the entrance exam once he became the #1 hero. When Aldra's principal called both Izuku and Bakugo into his office to congratulate both of them on getting into UA, Bakugo nearly had an aneurysm, staring at Izuku like he had never seen him before. Izuku had to dig his nails into his palm to prevent himself from laughing in the principal's face and flipping him off. He had been in this man's office with Bakugo many times, and without him even more, but never to be congratulated. In fact, the man looked distinctly irritated at having to say good job. Izuku just smiled politely, bowing and thanking him, though the gratitude felt like acid on his tongue, and his quirk boiled with his anger. As soon as they got outside, Bakugo grabbed him and slammed him into the wall, demanding to know what sort of tricks he had used to pass the exam. Izuku very nearly told him that he had gotten first place, just to mess with him, but luckily his survival instincts kicked in. Instead he just glared back and asked why he thought Izuku would tell him anything, especially when he was still acting like a bully. Bakugo had flinched and yanked back his hand, as though Izuku had burned him. Izuku had firmly told Bakugo that he had no say in how Izuku lived his life, and that if he tried to interfere again there would be consequences. And then he ran as fast as he could. Hitoshi had been really upset for a while, but about a week after the letters came, he suddenly appeared in the dreamscape with a small, hopeful smile on his face. When Izuku asked what had him so cheerful, Hitoshi had grabbed his hands and beamed at him. "A chance," he had whispered almost reverently. "I have one more chance." Izuku had scooped him up and hugged him tightly, relieved at the revival of his friend's hope. Hitoshi had then thrown himself into training, specifically hand-to-hand and refining his quirk. He was always hesitant to use his quirk on Izuku, even after years of them training together, but Izuku honestly didn't mind. Hitoshi's quirk made it feel like his mind was being wrapped in a warm, weighted blanket. He could see how it could be scary if it was forced on you, and you were struggling against it, but Izuku never did. In fact, he had asked Hitoshi to use it on him a few times to help him calm down. The first day of school was insane. First of all, the nice girl, Uraraka, the glasses boy, Ida, one of the kids he had helped out during the entrance exam, Kaminari, and freaking Bakugo were all in his class. And then his homeroom teacher crawled in, and it was Eraserhead of all people. Izuku nearly passed out from excitement, but managed not to embarrass himself by squealing or asking for an autograph or anything. They had a quirk assessment test, because apparently Aizawa-sensei didn't want to sit through orientation. He didn't say that, but Izuku had been around Hitoshi long enough to know that's what he meant. Actually, it was a little weird how similar Hitoshi and Aizawa were. Izuku would bet anything that the hero secretly fed stray cats, and was probably a coffee addict. He even did a whole speech about how learning to be a hero wasn't supposed to be fun, which Izuku thought was bullshit. Why wouldn't you enjoy watching yourself grow? And said that whoever came in last place would be expelled. Admittedly, that was a bit nerve-wracking, even though Izuku was fairly confident in himself. Bakugo had insisted on going first for the ball throw, giving Izuku a smug look when everyone cheered for his score. Izuku just rolled his eyes, which made Bakugo twitch in irritation. When it was Izuku's turn, he took a deep breath, activated 10% of One for All, and threw the ball as hard as he could. The shock wave sent air blasting into his face, but he didn't wait to recover before bolting to hide behind Eraserhead. Just in time, too, as Bakugo lost his sheet, screaming and blasting and trying to attack Izuku. He demanded to know how and when he got a quirk, trying to step around the hero to attack Izuku, but luckily Eraserhead intervened and tied him up with his capture weapon. It was kind of weird to see it used right in front of him by someone besides Hitoshi. Bakugo eventually settled down, though he kept glaring at Izuku, hands twitching as he growled under his breath. Izuku made sure to stay as far as possible from him for the rest of the tests, though the encounters still left him shaking. He could feel Aizawa staring at him, but he couldn't read the man's expression, which only put him more on edge. Kaminari and Uraraka enthusiastically cheered for him while he did his tests, only stopping when Izuku was bright red and stammering as he tried to shush them. He got first place on the tests, but it was closer than he had expected, and he had to push himself a little more than he would have liked. Bakugo got fourth, and Izuku could practically hear him foaming at the mouth. Aizawa tried to stop him after class, but he managed to slip away. He didn't particularly feel like spending an hour dodging questions about his quirk. Besides, if he delayed for too long, he would have to ride the train with Bakugo, which definitely wouldn't end well. On the way out, he overheard the girl with the hearing quirk, Jiro, stop Bakugo to talk with him. Izuku hung back just in case. She told Bakugo that she had enhanced hearing, and asked him to let her know before he let off an explosion, since they could really hurt her. Bakugo just scoffed and waved her off, mumbling something like yeah. She glared and flipped him off behind his back before stomping off in the other direction. Hitoshi also seemed to have a good day at school. He didn't get into specifics, but apparently his homeroom teacher was nice, if a bit loud, and the orientation was boring. He had talked to someone once, and begrudgingly admitted that they might have the potential to become a friend. Izuku tried to keep his tone excited while he told him about Kaminari and Uraraka, but Hitoshi seemed to be able to sense that something was wrong. After a bit of poking and prodding, he did eventually get Izuku to admit that Bakugo was in his class, and the boy had been said. Izuku quickly diverted the conversation by talking about his homeroom teacher, though he didn't say it was Eraserhead. Instead, he cheerfully said looked a lot like Hitoshi, and even acted like him too. Hitoshi had glared at him, but huffed and let the topic change. The next day at school was much more calm. It was the first day of actual lessons, and Izuku was nearly vibrating out of his chair with excitement at the idea of getting to meet all these pro-heroes. Aizawa shot him a glare during homeroom, evidently not happy that he had slipped away the day before, and told him in no uncertain terms that they would be having a meeting after school. Izuku put on his best chastised face and nodded meekly, which to his confusion only served to make the hero scowl more. Maybe heroes were better at telling when they were being pandered to than normal teachers. Classes were mostly pretty boring, as expected. Even so, Izuku had to keep a hand pressed firmly to his mouth to keep from mumbling about heroes the whole time, since he had the bad luck of being placed right behind Bakugo in the seating chart. English was alright. Present mic was pretty loud, but he seemed invested in getting them excited to learn. Too bad Izuku was already mostly fluent. Lunch was fun, since Kaminari and Uraraka immediately latched onto him and directed him to sit with them. Ida looked a little lost, so Izuku grabbed him too, even though he privately thought that the boy was a bit stuck up. Kaminari seemed bright and bubbly at first, but his sense of humor was surprisingly dry, though he also threw in a lot of memes and self-deprecating jokes. Izuku thought that him and Hitoshi would probably get along well. Ida seemed physically incapable of talking about anything other than schoolwork, but he did start to relax as the conversation went on, so maybe there was hope for him yet. Uraraka was cheerful, but also seemed unable to back down from a challenge. So, all in all, he thought that his first 3 friends weren't too shabby. Izuku was practically buzzing with excitement as he got ready for their first practical heroics lesson, more than ready to see his hero costume for the first time. Only, when he pulled it out, he was quite suddenly reminded of who he had based his costume off of. And who his teacher was. He dropped his head into his hands with a groan loud enough that even Ida got concerned. When Izuku explained that his costume was inspired by Eraserhead, the hero who teaches our practical heroics class, Kaminari just laughed at him. Izuku pouted and kicked him in the shin, but the boy wasn't deterred, just continued to tease him for being a fanboy. Luckily, one of the other kids, a boy named Kirishima, came to his defense, saying that his own costume was based off of Red Riot and that he would probably pass out if the hero saw it. Izuku had perked up and excitedly rambled about Red Riot as he unbuttoned his shirt, changing into his own costume. It wasn't anything super complicated like Ida's, but it wasn't as simple as Kaminari's either. It was a tight, sleeveless dark green hoodie with a pair of loose black cargo pants, a metal face guard shaped like a wide, toothy grin, a small homage to All Might, the hero who had originally inspired him, not the man who passed off OP quirks like hot potatoes, and bicep length. Black, red, and green gloves. Everything was fireproof and slash-resistant, which made the fabric a bit stiff. He intended to add more armor when he got older, but for now this was fine. He wrapped the capture weapon around his neck, and though it wasn't exactly the same as the one in his dreams, the familiar weight of it was still comforting. He attached iron coverings to his bright red shoes, raked his hair into a ponytail, and walked out onto the field. Everyone else's costume were incredibly cool too. No one else seemed to have as much armor as Ida. Kirishima was actually shirtless, but then again Izuku thought he remembered the boy mentioning a hardening quirk. He hadn't used it much during the quirk assessment test, so it was hard to remember. In fact, almost no one had any armor at all. Uraraka was in a skin-tight bodysuit, something that she seemed incredibly embarrassed about. Apparently, she wanted to be a rescue hero, and was inspired by the Space Hero 13. Izuku gushed with her about heroes for a while, until she suddenly perked up. "Ah, your costume," she said, and Izuku stiffened. "Doesn't it look a lot like Aizawa-sensei's dash?" He quickly pressed a hand to her mouth and frantically shushed her, but it was too late. Aizawa had already turned to look at them. Izuku froze, staring at the hero with wide eyes. Aizawa regarded him for a moment, and then snorted and turned away. Izuku promptly turned bright red, letting out a low groan as he crouched down and clasped his hands over the back of his neck. Kaminari laughed blatantly at him, while Uraraka crouched next to him with a small smile. "Ah, sorry," she said cheerfully, not sounding sorry at all. "Was it supposed to be a secret? You're such a fanboy." Kaminari teased, also crouching down next to him and poking his head. "If you didn't want him to know you're a fan, you shouldn't have designed your costume after him." "How was I supposed to know that he worked here?" Izuku groaned, covering his face with his hands. "Geez, this is the worst." "Well, I guess you'll just have to be prepared to die," Kaminari said. Izuku shot him a half-hearted glare. Luckily, before Izuku could ask Uraraka to float him into the sun, Aizawa called their attention. They spent the first few minutes of class testing their support equipment, and Izuku had some fun figuring out the capture weapon. It moved a little different than the one he imagined, and he got slapped in the face by it more than once, but after about 5 minutes had passed he was mostly confident. The whole time, Izuku made sure to keep an eye on Bakugo. He didn't like the look of those gauntlets, nor did he like the way the smell of nitroglycerin around him seemed to triple when he put them on. Even worse was the way the boy kept watching Aizawa-sensei, obviously waiting for him to turn his back. Izuku thought that he probably wouldn't try anything, at the very least because he wouldn't risk getting himself expelled. And yet, he couldn't help the creeping anxiety up his spine. He moved a bit closer to Jiro just in case. A few minutes later, out of the corner of his eye, Izuku saw Aizawa turn around to talk to Ida, and he saw Bakugo grin and raise his arm. Immediately Izuku knew he wasn't going to be able to stop him in time, so he gritted his teeth and whirled to face Jiro, quickly slapping his hands over her ears. She jolted in surprise and stared up at him, hands coming up to his. "Me Midori dash?" she started to ask. Izuku closed his eyes against a bright flash of light, moments before the loudest sound he had ever heard slammed through his skull. Everyone in the room jumped and whirled around, some of them even shrieking in surprise. Izuku let out a soft hiss of pain as Jiro did the same, and he looked up to see Bakugo sitting on the floor, wearing a slightly stunned expression. He still had one arm pointed towards the sky, smoke and dust surrounding him. Directly above him, a perfectly circular hole was carved into the clouds. "Holy shit!" Kaminari croaked, staring upwards. "Did you see that? That could kill someone. Is that even legal?" The comment jolted Izuku out of his daze and he stepped back, wincing at how loudly his ears were ringing. He had been on the wrong end of an explosion one too many times. Or rather, 300 too many times. He rubbed his ears, glaring at Bakugo's back as Aizawa stormed over to him, looking downright murderous. "Sorry," Izuku mumbled to Jiro, still glaring at Bakugo. "No thanks?" Jiro said, also rubbing her ears. Izuku nodded distractedly, trying to focus on Bakugo and Aizawa's conversation. He couldn't hear everything they were saying, but he got the gist of it. Aizawa was said because he told Bakugo to wait to try out his gauntlets, and Bakugo was said both at the idea that he wasn't the first priority and the idea of having consequences for his actions. When Bakugo showed absolutely no remorse or respect, Aizawa told him to hand over the gauntlets, saying he could get them back when he learned to think about how his actions might affect others. Izuku had to bite back a grin as Bakugo pitched a fit, and was met with nothing but an unimpressed glare. Finally, 10 minutes into the lesson, Aizawa gathered them around. He told them they were going to be doing battle trials, where they split the class up into heroes and villains and faced off against each other. He grumbled about how this exercise would have happened in about a week, to give him time to figure out their combat levels, but something about scheduling conflicts and interfering old BSTRDS. Izuku and Uraraka got paired up to be a team, and he grinned and high-fived her, only to have to scramble to tether himself with his capture weapon when he began floating off the ground. Uraraka apologized frantically, but Izuku just laughed and waved her off. The battles were insane. The first one was between Todoroki and Kaminari versus Ojiro and Hagakure. Todoroki iced the whole building, trapping their opponents, and Kaminari pouted about being left out. Aizawa sighed and called the win. When the two of them got back, he told Todoroki that in a live combat scenario, a drastic measure like that would be considered a last resort, as some people had quirks that made them more susceptible to low temperatures or swift temperature changes. Not to mention the nightmare that was property damage, or the risk of sudden movements setting off the bomb, or all sorts of other things. He also suggested that perhaps Todoroki might consider working with his team during a team exercise. Todoroki had just nodded silently, face completely blank while the other three participants pouted. The next battle was Mineta and Yaoyorozu versus Kirishima and Tokoyami. Mineta and Yaoyorozu set up several traps, though Yaoyorozu did all the planning, despite being visibly reluctant to work with the boy. It quickly became clear why when Mineta spent the whole time drooling over her. Tokoyami sent his quirk to scout ahead, but that still wasn't enough to keep them from getting caught in the more hidden traps. In the end, Yairozu's team won by waiting out the full 10 minutes. When they returned, Aizawa congratulated Yairozu, told Tokoyami and Kirishima to remember that the door oftentimes wasn't the only entrance to a building, and then shot a vicious glare at Mineta before turning back to the class. He told them that, unfortunately, if you chose to be a daylight hero, there would be times when you would have to deal with touchy fans. He also told them that this could happen to heroes of any gender, and that reacting with violence could be potentially career-ruining for the hero involved. He then went on to say that although that was true, they were not heroes yet, and if anyone made them uncomfortable in that way, they should tell him immediately. Izuku had nearly been starry-eyed with wonder at the idea of a teacher actually offering to help, though maybe Aizawa didn't count because he was a hero too. And then his good mood was ruined by the announcement that he would be facing off against Bakugo and Ida, but shockingly he wasn't worried about teacher's pet Ida literally murdering him. Boy, would he regret thinking that later. He nearly had a panic attack when Bakugo sent him a familiar, viscous grin that promised nothing but pain. He was incredibly glad that Aizawa had taken the boy's gauntlets already, otherwise Izuku probably wouldn't survive this fight. Luckily, Uraraka's enthusiasm helped calm him down enough for him to realize the opportunity that he had. Yeah, it was a school-sanctioned excuse for Bakugo to beat him up, but that went both ways. Izuku could do practically anything and probably get away with it. He quietly explained to her that Bakugo hated working with people, and that he was definitely going to split off and chase after Izuku first, leaving Ida to cover the bomb. He laid out his plan to deal with Bakugo while she snuck around to get to Ida, whose speed would give him a disadvantage in a zero-G scenario. He also made sure to tell her that she didn't have to fully incapacitate Ida, just tap him and then touch the bomb, or worst case stall long enough for Izuku to get there. She agreed with a determined nod, saying that she would be alright with losing to Ida, but that Bakugo's nasty attitude really made her want to win against him. Izuku had to press a hand to his mouth to hide a smile. He quickly gave her a rundown of Ida's quirk, blushing when she complimented how smart he was. Just then, Aizawa called the start of the match. Izuku mentally apologized to Uraraka for not telling her that the better plan would have been to float through a window on one of the upper floors, hopefully bypassing Bakugo entirely. He had a point to prove, and an opportunity to prove it, and he wasn't going to let that get away from him. The two of them ran through the building together, Izuku in the front. They got all the way to the second floor before Izuku heard the familiar sound of explosions. He jumped up, wrapping his capture weapon around the vents and Uraraka, pulling them both up to the ceiling without needing her quirk. She let out a yelp of surprise, but quickly realized what his plan was and went silent. Seconds later, Bakugo rounded the corner, looking furious. Izuku felt himself begin to shake with fear, but he didn't move until Bakugo was directly under him. Then, in the same movement, he swung down and kicked Bakugo in the gut while simultaneously throwing Uraraka down the hall. She yelped and stumbled slightly, but managed to keep her feet under her and keep running as Bakugo jumped to his feet with a snarl. Izuku immediately sent out a length of his capture weapon, but it still wasn't responding quite how he expected, and it wrapped itself around Bakugo's wrist a bit too loosely. Still though, he managed to yank an explosion off course before Bakugo pulled himself free. Bakugo started to say something, an insult most likely, but Izuku had terror in his heart and rage in his ears, and he couldn't hear anything but the roar of explosions. Izuku ducked under an outstretched palm and grabbed Bakugo by the arm, flipping him over his shoulder and wrapping his capture weapon tightly around the arm in the same motion. Bakugo choked as he hit the ground, all the air forced out of his lungs, and Izuku didn't give him time to recover as he pressed a foot to Bakugo ribs and yanked his arm back, dislocating it. Bakugo screamed, though it quickly tapered off into a snarl as he tried to roll to his feet, using a few small explosions to give the movement more momentum. Izuku didn't let him, using the capture weapon to JRK his arm forward, so he both stumbled and was distracted by the pain, then swept his legs out from under him and planted a foot on his back. He quickly managed to grab Bakugo's other hand and wrench it behind him, binding his wrists together with the provided capture tape. He began to move back, already knowing that Bakugo wouldn't stop despite being captured, but he was too slow. With a snarl of rage and pain, Bakugo pressed both palms directly into Izuku's stomach and let loose a massive explosion. Izuku went flying back, but then the capture weapon still around Bakugo's arms snapped taut, yanking him to a halt. He let out a hiss of pain as his neck jerked forcefully, but it was nothing compared to sound Bakugo made when it yanked on his injured arm. It only took Izuku a moment to clamber to his feet again. Bakugo was struggling to wriggle out of the capture tape, but was unable to with one shoulder hurt. Bakugo Katsuki has been captured. Aizawa's voice droned over the speakers. Bakugo let out a wordless scream of fury that sent a spike of fear right through Izuku's heart. Still though, he couldn't stop now, so he set his expression into the perfectly blank one Hitoshi had taught him and knelt down next to Bakugo. "Where did your team plant the bomb?" he asked, unwinding the capture weapon from his arm. Bakugo's head jerked up in surprise, and his eyes widened as he took in the scorch mark on Izuku's stomach. Izuku smiled. "Surprised?" he asked cheerfully. "I asked the support department to make my costume fireproof, just for you. Now, tell me where the bomb is." "Shut up!" Bakugo yelled. "I haven't lost yet." Izuku felt his eye twitch in irritated. "Are you delusional?" he snapped. "You can't even move. Besides, Sensei already called it, so it doesn't matter what you think. I'd kick your butt in a real fight." "What part of this fight wasn't real?" Izuku snarled, gritting his teeth. "I outplayed you because I knew that you were stupid enough to split up from your teammate. I won because I planned ahead, and you just threw yourself in fists blazing. But that's not going to work anymore. You saw it with Todoroki and Yaoyorozu, didn't you? The student here are strong, stronger than you. I'm stronger than you. And guess what?" Izuku bared his teeth in a feral grin, ignoring Bakugo's snarls of rage. "I haven't used my quirk once this entire fight. I defeated you entirely quirkless." Bakugo froze. He stared at Izuku in utter disbelief. And then he screamed, a wordless sound of raw fury. Izuku flinched at the noise, instinctively bringing his hands up in a guard, and then scowled and forced his arms down, annoyed by his own fear. "Stop if you're looking down on me!" Bakugo screamed. "I'll stop looking down on you when you stop acting like a toddler." Izuku snapped, surprised at how steady his voice was despite how he trembled with fear. "I'm absolutely sick of you hurting people, through carelessness or just for fun. It pisses me off every time I have to cover for you because you couldn't be bothered to care about other people. Jiro has a FING hearing quirk, she told you she does, and you still let off that giant explosion. What the hell were you thinking? You could have deafened her, Katsuki. Why is it so hard for you to care about other people? I wish I never ran in that day," he blurted, fists clenched with fury. Izuku went still with horror as he realized what he had just said, but he forcibly dragged his anger back to the surface, turned on his heel and stalked away. Bakugo was silent behind him, and Izuku didn't look back to see what expression he was making. He just kept walking, shaking like a leaf. He made it 2 hallways away before his legs suddenly gave out. He stared blankly at the floor, and raised a trembling hand to his mouth to push down his nausea. He squeezed his eyes shut and pressed the heels of his hands to his eyes, trying desperately to slow his breathing. "Midoriya?" Aizawa's voice said in his ear. Izuku jolted in surprise. "Are you all right?" "Fine, sir," Izuku chirped, abruptly remembering the cameras. He plastered a smile on his face and dragged himself to his feet, ignoring how his legs were still trembling. "Just taking a breather." Before the hero could say anything else, Izuku switched the comm channel. "Uraraka, everything all right?" Yes," she replied, clearly startled by his voice, and then dropped her voice into a whisper. "I found the bomb. It's on the south corner of the building on the 5th floor. But Ida's guarding it and he cleared the room, so there's nothing for me to throw or hide behind." "Nothing to hide behind, huh?" Izuku mumbled, head tilted up. He let out a shaky breath, slapped his hands against his cheeks, and set his face into a determined frown. "All right, I've got a plan. I'll set up a good distraction, so be ready to get to the bomb." "You got it," Uraraka whispered back, equally determined. Izuku ran towards the side of the building until he got to a window. He yanked it open and jumped out without hesitation, sending one end of his capture weapon shooting up to wrap around the edge of the building as he wrapped the other end around one hand. He jerked to a stop and landed feet first on the side of the building, and from there all it took was a harsh yank and a one-for-all power jump to shoot himself up to the roof. He clambered to his feet, a soft smile stuck to his face from the adrenaline rush brought on by his free fall, and crossed to the south side of the building. He wrapped his capture weapon around a vent and lowered himself down to the 5th floor, and peered through the window. Once he saw Ida standing next to the bomb, he took a deep breath, lined himself up, and kicked off of the building with a healthy dose of one for all. The momentum brought him nearly vertical before gravity grabbed him again and sent him swinging back down, crashing feet first through the window and slamming directly into Ida. "Now, Uraraka!" Izuku yelled, unwrapping his capture weapon from the vent and yanking it back towards him as he sat on top of Ida's back. Ida tried to push himself up, but by then it was too late. "Hero team wins," Izawa said, in his usual bored tone. Ida sagged in disappointment, and then looked up at Izuku with a small smile. "That was rather clever of you," Ida said, still looking disappointed as Izuku helped him up. "I had assumed, with Uraraka in front of me, that there was no way for you to come through the window. That was my mistake." Izuku sent him a sheepish smile. "It's okay," he said. "Most people wouldn't have risked something like that for a school exercise, so you probably would have been fine if your opponent had been anyone else." "Why did you?" Ida asked curiously, brushing himself off. "Risk it, I mean." "Oh, don't you know?" Uraraka said cheerfully, slinging an arm over Izuku's shoulder. "This guy's an adrenaline junkie." "Uraraka!" Izuku squeaked, blushing bright red as Ida's jaw dropped. "Surely that wasn't the only reason?" Ida protested weakly. Izuku only blushed harder and ducked his head, which made Uraraka laugh. "Hey, you said it yourself, didn't you?" she teased as they walked out to the hall, heading back towards the viewing chamber. Izuku pouted at her while Ida sputtered. By the time they got to the 2nd floor, the medbots had already grabbed Bakugo and carted him off to Recovery Girl, so they continued straight to the observation room. Izawa already had his hand pressed to his forehead when they arrived, which made Izuku tense up. He told them that the hero team technically won, but that they really should have taken down Bakugo together and then moved on to Ida instead of giving up their numbers advantage. Izuku nodded meekly as he was scolded for his excessive force, though he was a bit stunned when the man admitted that it made sense for him to be wary of Bakugo given his personality. He also added that Bakugo should not have continued fighting after being restrained, even if that was more realistic, while gesturing to the scorch marks on Izuku's stomach. Izuku didn't really know what to think. He had never had a teacher even attempt to defend his actions before, and he was struggling to decide if this time was different because his teacher was Eraserhead or because he had a quirk now. Either way, it was bizarre, and he wasn't sure if he entirely disliked the feeling. After class ended, Izuku changed back into his school uniform and warily approached the classroom. Aizawa-sensei was there waiting for him. Izuku spent the next hour mumbling yes sir and no sir while dodging questions about his quirk, his scars, and his relationship with Bakugo. The hero grew visibly more frustrated as time passed, which Izuku felt a little bad for, but he didn't let anything slip. Just kept his eyes on the ground and his tone perfectly meek and polite. Finally, the teacher sighed and let him leave. Izuku bolted from the room, not bothering to hide his relief as he ran to the train station, already planning what he would say to Hitoshi. When he got home, he went through his usual routine as fast as possible. He only did half of his usual weight training, figuring that it was better for him to cut down a bit now that he had hero training at school too. Then he took a quick shower and dove into bed with a grin. He sagged in relief when he opened his eyes in the dreamscape, already waving away his injuries as he shifted the room to look like a clearing in the center of a forest. He was in a bit of a rush, so looking closely at the trees would reveal a weird blurriness to them, but it was fine. He covered the ground in moss and grass and tiny flowers before putting down a blanket and some junk food. Then he quickly set up their usual training station, which had 2 capture weapons, a big white ring in the floor, and a few things like fake knives and boxing gloves. Izuku adjusted the capture weapons so they moved like the ones in real life and then waiting for Hitoshi to show up. Once his friend popped into existence, Izuku barely held himself back long enough to let the boy wave away his injuries before tackling him into the ring. Hitoshi let out a startled laugh as the two began wrestling, both grinning wildly. Since they couldn't feel pain in their dreams, they tended to get a little bit reckless during their fights. Biting, scratching, hair pulling, the whole deal. Izuku was sure they would have looked insane to anyone else, but it was just the two of them there, like always, so it was fine. Eventually, Hitoshi pinned him down, and Izuku began babbling about some new research he had done about the capture weapons and DNA and quirk factors and blah blah blah, basically telling Hitoshi that he had made them more realistic while lying about why and how he had done it. Hitoshi perked up, immediately scrambling to go try it out, though his enthusiasm faded a bit when he got himself all tangled up. Luckily, he figured it out pretty quickly, since it wasn't a huge change. They spent the next hour or so sparring, shifting the landscape around them to attack or defend as they talked about their days. Hitoshi had made a friend, and Izuku was excited, until he pressed further and realized the boy was talking about yet another stray cat. "I got into a fight with Bakugo today," Izuku said, swiping a hand forward to drive a spike of rock up towards Hitoshi's ribs. The other boy dodged easily, giving him an odd look as he looped his capture weapon around Izuku's ankle, yanking him to the ground. "A fight," Hitoshi said, dragging him closer and aiming an elbow at his throat. "Not beaten up by?" "No, it was a fight," Izuku said, blocking the blow and then snapping a leg up to slam his knee into the other boy's gut. I think maybe I won?" "Really?" Hitoshi said, delighted enough that he didn't react in time as Izuku put him in a chokehold. "Yeah, really," Izuku said, squeezing as hard as he could. "I mean, he would never admit it, but he had to go to the nurse after and I didn't, so I think that means I won?" Hitoshi tapped his leg twice, and Izuku obediently let go. "That's awesome," Hitoshi said once he caught his breath. "How bad? Tell me what you did." "Calm down, you little Izzy," Izuku said, giggling. "I definitely dislocated his arm, and I hit in the stomach hard enough to wind him, so that'll probably bruise. To be honest, I kinda got the drop on him, so it was over pretty quick." "Tell me you did not literally drop down on him," Hitoshi said. Izuku just grinned. "That's awesome, Izu. Show me the memory." "Why, sure. 1 second. Izuku's brow furrowed as he focused the memory of the fight, editing their hero costumes to be a different school's regular uniforms, cut it off before the end of the match, took out Uraraka, and changed some of the dialogue. Then he conjured up a projector screen and played the memory on it, taking the opportunity to grab some water. Hitoshi watched with rapt attention, cheering as he watched Izuku swing down from a vent and kick Bakugo in the gut hard enough to send him flying with the aid of what looked to him like a piece of rope he had scooped up a few minutes before. He let out a startled shriek of delight when on screen Izuku bared his teeth and wrenched Bakugo's arm out of its socket, which made the actual Izuku let out an embarrassed little chuckle. He let out a low, impressed whistle when Izuku tied Bakugo up, and then nodded along to his little speech. Izuku cut out the part about wishing he had never run in, since he had never ended up telling Hitoshi about the sludge villain. And then, because he felt bad for lying so much, he left in his mini panic attack, which had Hitoshi leaning into his side and nuzzling against his hair. "That was incredible, Izu," Hitoshi said, grinning. And then he faltered slightly. "Ah, but you didn't get in trouble, right?" "Nah, I didn't," Izuku said, smiling back. "I think my teacher this year might actually be decent." "Your teacher, the one you said reminds you of me?" "Yeah, I sure hope he's decent," Hitoshi muttered, making Izuku laugh and wrap an arm around his shoulders to pull him into a hug. "Seriously, I think you'd like him though. Maybe he's your long-lost dad." "Boo, I don't need that deadbeat," Hitoshi said with mock disgust. Izuku laughed, and then without warning tackled his friend to the floor and tried to put him in an armbar, one that was quickly foiled as the two of them devolved into grappling again. They spent the rest of the night alternating between beating the crap out of each other sparring and cuddling, which seemed to be the usual these days. Not that Izuku was complaining, of course. Ending the day laying breathless and giggling in a heap with Hitoshi was one of his favorite things in the world. The next week or so was fairly normal. Or at least normal for a hero school. The whole time Bakugo and Izuku avoided each other like the plague. The most notable thing that happened was that they had to vote for a class president and vice president. Izuku immediately offered the idea that people could opt out, and then proceeded to do so. He was extremely glad he did when his friends said they all would have voted for him. That would have been a nightmare. Yaoyorozu because class president, with Ida as vice. Ida seemed disappointed, and Kaminari did not help the situation by basically saying he would have won if he was more likable. Izuku had quickly scrambled to perform damage control, saying that it was admirable that Ida stuck to his morals despite what other people thought, which seemed to work. They only had 2 practical heroics lessons a week, the others were all theoretical heroics, which was the legal and ethical side of things, though the legal stuff was mostly saved until their later years. Their next lesson was rescue training at USJ, which went pretty well. Izuku found out that his suit was not water-friendly, though luckily Azui reminded him to take off the metal coverings for his shoes, so he didn't drown. Bakugo bombed the rescue training, and not in a good way. He brought down 3 fake buildings through sheer carelessness before Aizawa forced him to sit out. A boy with spiky red hair named Kirishima tried to sit with Bakugo, and was quickly driven off, which was kinda sad to see. It was awesome to meet 13 though. There was one time, when he was waiting in the dreamscape for Hitoshi, that he saw something. It was some sort of fuzzy shape just out of the corner of his eye. It looked almost human-shaped, reaching for him, but when he turned to look there was nothing there. It left him uneasy, though, so he just tried not to think about it. It was probably a trick of the light, anyways. And then Ira's Izao-sensei announced that it was time for the sports festival. Izuku was practically vibrating with excitement. Like All Might said, this was his chance to present himself to the world. To prove to everyone that he wasn't Deku anymore. They had 2 weeks to prepare, and Izuku fully intended to use all of that time practicing his quirk control and his hand-to-hand combat skills. Maybe he could request the help of Ojiro, or maybe Shoji. He shoved his books into his bag, nodding along as Kaminari rambled something about an immortal snail, though Uraraka was insistent that it was cruel to subject an animal to a life of eternal chase, or something. Honestly, Izuku wasn't really paying attention. He was currently running through every plan he could think of for defeating his classmates, while also wondering if he could find a way to scope out the kids in the other courses. Luckily, it seemed like some other kids had the same idea. Bakugo opened the classroom door only to come face to face with 6 or 7 kids from Gen Ed and 1B. They didn't seem aggressive or anything, just curious. Kaminari was still talking about the snail though, so Izuku was paying half attention to each conversation as Bakugo snarked at some Gen Ed kid. Izuku pulled on his backpack, and after another glance at Bakugo decided that he didn't look like he was about to start a fight, so he turned his attention back to Kaminari. Wait, hold on, do we both die if the snail touches me? He asked, confused. Because, like, is it a suicidal snail? Does it not want to live forever? Or is it being forced to chase me? You're asking too many questions that I don't have answers to. Kaminari said. You're trying to escape it, not play snail therapist. That's not very heroic of you. Izuku mumbled, making Uraraka laugh. Come on, Bakugo, leave it be. Someone, probably Kirishima, said. F off, he's the one who tried to start something first. Bakugo snapped. Bakugo, one of the Gen Ed kids said slowly. Their voice sounded so weird, sort of rich and smooth, in a way that rumbled through his skull and echoed down his spine, making his mind blank for half a second, that Izuku physically paused before blinking and shaking it off. Bakugo Katsuki? Do you have an explosion quirk? They continued. Huh? Yeah, that's right. How the F, do you know my name? Right. The kid said, sounding baffled. And do you know a guy named Izuku? Izuku looked up at the sound of his name. What? He said, and the class shifted to let him pass. Sorry, did someone say my name dash? Izuku froze. His entire world narrowed to a tunnel, because standing there right in front of him was Hitoshi, looking just as shell-shocked as he felt. At first, he thought he was hallucinating, but Bakugo had been talking to him just a few seconds ago. And then he thought that maybe he had seen the kid somewhere before, and his subconscious had used the poor kid's appearance for his imaginary friend. But the kid had recognized Bakugo and asked for Izuku by name. So, was he dreaming right now? At the exact same time, both of them reached down and pinched their arms, and then both winced as the pain came through loud and clear. Not a dream, which meant Hitoshi was real. His imaginary friend was real. He had been pulling a poor kid into his dreams to use as a bomb for his touch starvation for 8 years. No, even worse, Hitoshi had been being hurt for all these years and Izuku had done nothing to help him. Shit, he had never told Hitoshi he got into UA, or that he had a quirk now, or, wait, how had the boy gotten into his dreams in the first place? Had he secretly had a quirk this whole time? Izuku wasn't breathing. Or maybe he was breathing too quickly. Was he having a panic attack? Did it matter? Hitoshi was standing in front of him. In real life, what was he supposed to say? What should he do? Everyone was staring at them, and Izuku couldn't breathe. What the F dash dot? Hitoshi whispered. And that was too much. The quiet horror in his voice, mixed with something like betrayal or anger, Izuku bolted. He turned and ran, hopping up onto his desk and yanking open the window before anyone could stop him. Don't you effing dare dash. Hitoshi snarled, but Izuku was already throwing himself out the window with zero hesitation, accompanied by the sound of his friend's startled shrieks. Unfortunately, he had forgotten one important detail. Hitoshi was just as crazy and overwhelmed with emotion as he was. The other boy jumped out right after him. Izuku tumbled to the ground, hissing in pain as the movement jammed his bag into his back. He got up and kept running, not even thinking to use his quirk because his mind was numb with real dash. A body slammed into Izuku, tackling him to the floor. The two of them wrestled with each other, and Izuku knew him. He knew that hair and that face that was twisted into a snarl and those eyes that were staring at him like he had killed his dad or something. Why? Hitoshi snarled, one hand clutching his collar and the other raised in a fist, like he was going to punch him, but Izuku didn't even think about flinching because Hitoshi didn't hurt him. Why did you do it? Why did you just let me believe you weren't real? Why? Honestly, Izuku was impressed with himself for keeping his composure for that long. But really, it was inevitable that was going to react by bursting into tears. He wouldn't be a Midoriya if he didn't. He immediately began scrubbing at his face, trying to wipe away the tears before they stopped flowing. What the hell are you crying for? Hitoshi said quietly, and when Izuku peeked up through his hands he saw the boy had lowered his fist and hung his head. He looked defeated. I'm the one that wants to cry, you know. I'm sorry dash, Izuku sobbed, trying to force back his tears. I'm so relieved. I thought I had dreamed up my only friend. Hitoshi blinked and then looked up, staring at him incredulously. And then he laughed, a breathless, hysterical sound that left him doubled over with gasps, forehead pressed to Izuku's sternum. Hitoshi gasped, still laughing. We're so fed up, aren't we? Izuku laughed thickly, reaching up wrap his arms around Hitoshi. Yeah, Izuku giggled. Yeah, we are. I've got so much to tell you. Me too. Hitoshi whispered. Izuku reached up to cup his cheek, wiping the boy's tears away with his thumb. Hitoshi's eyes slid shut and he leaned into his touch, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Run away with me. Izuku whispered. Hitoshi's eyes snapped open. My classmates are gonna chase us. He clarified. We have to run, or else we're gonna have to answer a lot of very awkward questions. Hitoshi huffed out a quiet laugh. Yeah, Hitoshi mumbled, nuzzling into his hand. I'll follow you wherever you want. Izuku's breath caught in his throat. He leaned forward, taking in Hitoshi's expression with wide eyes as he moved to, well, he didn't know what he was going to do. It didn't matter anyways, because just then Izuku heard Uraraka's voice calling out for him. He quickly pushed aside all the weird feelings that had been welling up and shot his friend a grin. Hold on tight. Izuku said. Hitoshi didn't even blink, just quickly leaned down and wrapped his arms tightly around Izuku's torso. When you spend half your time in a dreamscape where anything is possible, you get good at following directions fast. Izuku rolled to his feet, clutching Hitoshi to his chest, and used a burst of one for all to take off running. Hitoshi let out a quiet yelp and held him closer, which just made Izuku giggle to himself. "You Quirk," Hitoshi said, startled. Izuku laughed harder, skidding around a corner. "Oh, I have got so much to tell you," he replied giddily. "You'll never believe how bullshit my life is." "I'll believe you," Hitoshi mumbled into his neck. Izuku felt a warm feeling grow in his chest, and he gave his friend a quick squeeze as a silent thank you. The two of them came to a halt outside a window, and Izuku paused with his hand on the latch. "I'm gonna need you to act as pitiful as possible for a few seconds, okay?" "Got it," Hitoshi said, and then ducked his head and hunched his shoulders and began to tremble, breath coming in short gasps. Izuku threw open the window and pulled the two of them inside, into the nurse's office. Recovery Girl wasn't pleased, of course, scolding them for tracking dirt in, but Izuku just gave her his most wide-eyed panicked look and said, "Hitoshi's having a panic attack." And she quickly shuffled the two of them off into a small side room specifically for that purpose. And, though most people didn't know, it was one of the few rooms in the building without cameras or microphones or anything. "That was pretty good acting," Hitoshi said, getting his feet back under him and letting go of Izuku. "You weren't so bad yourself," Izuku said as the two of them brushed dirt off of themselves before grabbing Hitoshi's hand and pulling him over to a corner. "Come on, we've gotta hurry. We've only got about an hour until lunch ends." Hitoshi followed him obediently, and the two of them ignored the chairs and table in the room in favor of curling up together in the far corner of the room. Izuku closed his eyes, and barely had time to hear Hitoshi start to say something before he opened them in the dreamscape again. Almost immediately, Hitoshi popped into existence next to him with a small frown. At first, there had almost always been a delay between the time Izuku entered the dream world and when Hitoshi did, sometimes by minutes and sometimes by hours. But lately, Izuku found that he could pull Hitoshi in whenever he wanted, as opposed to waiting for him to arrive. Which made sense if this was his original quirk, and one for all was, what, strengthening it? Boosting it? What if it? "I thought you said we didn't have time," Hitoshi said, dusting himself off. Izuku snapped back to attention and gave him a lopsided, nervous grin. "We don't. That's why I'm gonna show you my memories, unedited this time, so I don't accidentally leave anything out." Hitoshi froze. Izuku understood why. Sharing memories with someone was a bizarrely NTMT experience, because if you weren't careful you could feel echoes of what they had felt and thought at the time. They usually only did it to show each other something funny that had happened, or something cool that they did. They almost never did it with emotional stuff. "Are you sure?" Hitoshi asked quietly, taking his hand. Izuku nodded, even though he really wasn't. I don't want to keep any more secrets from you," Izuku said. "I want to show you everything. The only reason I didn't tell you before is because I didn't want to think about any of it while I was with you. I wanted to just escape." Hitoshi finished for him. "Forget about everything for a while. Just breathe." Izuku nodded, heart warmed at the knowledge that he had been an escape for Hitoshi just as much as the other boy had been for him. He summoned a small pile of pillows and blankets, knowing they would need the extra comfort, and then plopped down next to Hitoshi, holding his hand tightly. He sat there for a moment, and then giggled quietly. "Sorry," he said. I'm not sure where to start." Hitoshi didn't say anything, just squeezed his hand and leaned into his side, a silent show of support. Izuku took a deep breath and nodded to himself. "Right?" he mumbled. It's gotta be the sludge villain then." He conjured up the memory of the day of the sludge villain, starting after class ended. He skimmed over what Bakugo had said, but Hitoshi still caught it and scowled. He had already known about that, though, so he was more irritated than surprised. And then they got to the underpass. Hitoshi felt past Izuku's fear as the sewer grate rattled behind him, saw him try to run, saw him get caught anyways. Izuku tried to gloss over the attack, but Hitoshi didn't let him. He sat and he clutched Izuku's like a lifeline, keeping his eyes wide open for the whole thing as he forced himself to watch Izuku struggle, watch him drown, feel his fear and his anger and his desperation and listen to him think, "I don't want to die. Please don't kill me. Please help. I don't want to die." Izuku wrapped a blanket around both of their shoulders. Hitoshi didn't react. He didn't move, or blink, or even breathe until All Might appeared, and then all the tension bled out of him in a shaky sigh. He stiffened again quickly though when All Might contained the villain and then just sort of left, leaving Izuku coughing and retching up slime. Izuku rubbed a thumb over the back of Hitoshi's hand soothingly. It didn't seem to help much. Hitoshi glared at the screen and began muttering curses as he felt how hopeless the past Izuku felt, how rattled and afraid he was as he trudged home. And then past Izuku came upon another villain attack, only to discover it was the same villain. Izuku pushed through the crowd, baffled, and quite suddenly discovered that it was Bakugo who was the hostage. Hitoshi choked in surprise, and then gave a small smile when he felt past Izuku's irritation at the sight. And then Bakugo and Izuku locked eyes, and Hitoshi's breath caught as he saw the fear there. And then suddenly the other Izuku's annoyance turned to something like horror, and pity, and righteous fury. And then he was moving. Hitoshi tensed and gripped his hand tightly, watching the screen with wide eyes. Izuku squeezed his hand back, resting his head on his friend's shoulder. A silent reassurance. I'm here. I'm safe. I'll make it out okay. Hitoshi accepted it gratefully with a shaky breath. The two of them watched as screen Izuku ran forwards, pulling out a knife and leaping into action. Hitoshi grinned when Izuku plunged his knife into the villain's eye, though his every muscle still trembled with tension. He didn't relax until Izuku dragged Bakugo out of the sludge, and the two of them were blasted back into the arms of the heroes. Hitoshi mumbled a compliment as he leaned down and nuzzled Izuku's hair, making him blush. It was one thing to think he handled the situation well, and it was another thing entirely for Hitoshi to tell him he had. The peace didn't last for long, though, because as soon as the villain was apprehended, Bakugo began yelling about not wanting help from a quirkless loser, which made the heroes start to yell at Izuku for being reckless, which had Hitoshi gritting his teeth and glaring. His frown deepened when Izuku slipped away from a paramedic, not liking the idea of him going untreated, but didn't say anything. He knew why he had done it. He tensed again when a tall old man stopped Izuku on his way home. Past Izuku was immediately on guard, hand slipping into the pocket with the knife in it as he got ready to run, only for the man to puff up and turn into All Might. Hitoshi choked. Izuku could practically hear the boy's mind whirling as he forced himself not to say anything, though he did send Izuku a wary glance. Izuku returned it with a soothing smile, and they continued watching. They watched as the man almost instantly deflated and began coughing up blood before launching into an explanation. The man said he was All Might himself, and he simply had a strength quirk that was sort of like flexing. He said that ever since receiving a bad injury 5 years ago, he had been slowly running out of time in that form, which is why he had been in such a hurry earlier. Hitoshi felt past Izuku's unease as the weight of everything that had happened sunk in, and the feeling only grew along with his anger when the hero launched into a dramatic speech about how Izuku had the heart of a hero and was super brave, and how noble it was of him to throw himself into danger for his friend. Past Izuku cut off his rant, glaring at the hero as he tore into him. Hitoshi shot him a small, approving smile that did nothing to cover up his nerves. The two of them watched as All Might asked Izuku why he had run in, and Izuku quietly admitted that he didn't have a reason. He had just been scared. Scared of dying alone, scared of leaving Bakugo to die surrounded by people who were just watching, doing nothing to help. And then All Might ruin the moment by calling him brave, a hero, like he wasn't a 14-year-old putting his life on the line because he was terrified of watching someone he knew die. Hitoshi let out a quiet hiss of fury and quickly squeezed Izuku's hand. And then All Might said he was looking for a successor. Hitoshi froze. His head whipped around to stare at real Izuku, who dutifully avoided eye contact as the memory continued to play. Hitoshi looked back at the screen just in time to see All Might laugh and wink and cheerfully tell him he could fix his quirklessness. Past Izuku's terror slammed into both of them, making them shudder and lean closer together. Hitoshi looked frozen in shock, but behind that there was horror and rage as he gathered Izuku up in a hug that was quickly returned. All Might described One for All, and how it could be passed on, as the two boys clung to each other. They watched and felt, as past Izuku's horror shifted into terrified anger and disdain. And then, a vivid thought came through the memory. I can use this. Hitoshi inhaled sharply, hands beginning to shake. They couldn't hear past Izuku's individual thoughts, but they could feel his mind whirl with terror and confusion and hesitant hope. And then a second thought filtered through. What would Toshi do? It was incredibly embarrassing to feel how quickly that thought settled his nerves. Especially with Hitoshi himself sitting right next to him, pressing a hand to his face to hide how pink it was. Past Deku nervously asked for some time to think about, shaking in his boots as he prepared to run, but All Might allowed it with nothing more than quiet disappointment. All Might gave Izuku his number. Hitoshi glowered at the way Past Izuku stifled a flinch, and then asked for his name, which made Hitoshi roll his eyes and shake his head. Past Izuku quickly gave it, despite the ominous feeling it left with him, and then quickly ran home. Current Izuku skipped through the memory until he arrived home. Hitoshi turned to him, starting to say something, but Izuku shook his head. Not yet. Izuku said, Day's not over yet. There's more. Hitoshi said incredulously. Izuku nodded, and Hitoshi let out a shaky breath as he ran a thumb over the back of Izuku's neck soothingly. Christ, Izuku. Your life is effed up. Tell me about it. Izuku mumbled, leaning into the touch as he skipped to the part where Bakugo rang his doorbell. Hitoshi scowled at the sight of the boy, muttering a curse, and it only got worse when the first thing Past Izuku felt was concern. He knew about the unspoken agreement between the two boys, so he knew why Izuku was concerned, but he still didn't like it. Bakugo started yelling, predictably. And then, unexpectedly, Izuku yelled back, which made Hitoshi relax slightly and give him an affectionate head bonk. The two of them felt Past Izuku's irritation grow as Bakugo fumbled for words, and then spike into incredulous indignation. When he wanted to know why Izuku had hesitated, Hitoshi scoffed and crossed his arms, glaring at the screen as he muttered insults to himself. Izuku smiled slightly at the display, some of the tension in his shoulders easing. And then Hitoshi stiffened when Past Izuku rolled up his sleeves to show Bakugo his scars. He sent a glance at Present Izuku's hands, though he already knew he wouldn't see anything. Neither of them wore their scars in their dreams. Past Izuku tore into Bakugo, which made Hitoshi let out a quiet huff that was equal parts affectionate and amused. And then, when Past Izuku slammed the door in Bakugo's face, he laughed quietly and nuzzled into Present Izuku's hair. Izuku cut off the memory there, then moved on to the next day, when he had asked All Might all those questions. He only showed a few of the more important ones, including the last one, since they were low on time. But he made sure to show himself accepting just in case. Then he pretty quickly skimmed through the next 10 months, just showing a few flashes of Bakugo leaving him alone and some of his conversations with All Might, to show Hitoshi that the man was just an idiot, not a monster. Hitoshi snorted when he saw Izuku talk the hero out of being a teacher. He tried to skip through his training as fast as he could, but the two of them still caught flashes of some of the battery acid pain of his early days and the anxious glow of his later ones. He wanted to skip the entrance exam entirely, but a firm look from Hitoshi had him pouting and pulling it up anyways. Hitoshi snorted when he tripped at the gate and was caught by Uraraka, and Izuku elbowed him in the ribs. He skipped through the written exam and then showed the practical exam a little faster than he remembered, hoping Hitoshi would chalk the blurriness up to adrenaline. Still, even with that, the feral, roaring joy of being able to let loose with his quirk combined with the fuzzy pain of splitting his hands open on robot faces came through pretty clearly. Hitoshi let out an amused huff when he caught sight of Izuku's reflection in one of the fake building's windows, with his manic grin and bleeding knuckles. Izuku hid his face behind his hands and let out an embarrassed little groan. And then came the 0-pointer. Hitoshi heard Uraraka's quiet, ow, clearly, and sighed as he realized what was about to happen. Sure enough, not even a second later Izuku was flying through the air, slamming into and then through the robot's face. His pain and cursing came through the memory clearly, making Hitoshi both wince and shoot Izuku a smirk. Izuku ignored both, instead watching his past self tear at wires and metal with his bare hands. Once he had deactivated it, he wiggled back out of the hole he had made, and began tumbling back into open air, the blood on his hands having made his grip slippery. Hitoshi inhaled sharply as past Izuku's spike of fear came through to them. Izuku tried to catch himself on a building, but fell short, and panicked as he scrambled for a solution. A hand struck his cheek, and he bobbed in midair for a moment before Uraraka released her quirk and he hit the ground. Hitoshi let out a sigh of relief and gave present Izuku a small whack upside the head. "Don't worry me like that," he said, glaring. Izuku just let out an embarrassed little laugh, rubbing the back of his neck sheepishly. The two of them watched as past Izuku reveled in his victory, Quirk glowing warm in his chest despite his injuries. Hitoshi barked out a laugh when Uraraka called Izuku an optimist, only to be corrected to adrenaline junkie. Though his laughter quickly faded when he caught some of Izuku listing his injuries to Recovery Girl, despite how the boy tried to skip past it. He glowered even further when it was revealed that Izuku needed surgery, and saw how extensively his mom scolded him for it. Izuku tried to skip past the day they got their acceptance letters, but Hitoshi was adamant about finding out his score, so eventually Izuku showed him. Hitoshi's jaw dropped when he heard it, staring at Izuku like he'd never seen him before. And then it only got worse when they showed the clip of Uraraka offering up some of her points for him, and past Izuku burst into tears. Hitoshi hugged him close, telling him how proud he was, but Izuku still couldn't help but feel a bit guilty. After that, he skipped directly to the first day of school, and Hitoshi's eyes narrowed in irritation when he saw Bakugo was in his class, even though he had already known that. And then he elbowed Izuku in the ribs when Eraserhead walked in and introduced himself as their homeroom teacher. "I told you that you were similar," Izuku said cheerfully, and was hit in the face with a pillow in retaliation. Hitoshi grimaced at the mention of a quirk assessment test, something so obviously biased towards physical quirks. And then he grimaced more when Bakugo threw a tantrum at the sight of Izuku's shiny new quirk, though he relaxed when Aizawa interfered. He didn't even try to hide a grin at the sight of Izuku dominating the tests, and his new friends cheering him on loudly for it, and he practically cackled with glee when Bakugo scored 4th overall. He shot Izuku a look when the memory showed him avoiding Aizawa-sensei after class, because it was Eraserhead, but he didn't say anything. He was also a teacher, so it made sense to be wary. Izuku made sure to play the part of his memory where he overheard Jiro tell Bakugo about her hearing quirk, so Hitoshi would have context for later. He skipped through the beginning of the next day too, moving straight to his first practical heroics lesson, with a few flashes of him and his friends hanging out during lunch so that Hitoshi wouldn't be surprised when Izuku introduced him to them later. Izuku found he was unable to resist the urge to show off his hero costume, though he regretted that decision when Hitoshi snorted, realizing who his costume was based off of and who was teaching their next class. Still, he did begrudgingly admit that it was pretty cool, and Izuku made a mental note to help his friend draw up a design for his own costume. Then, because he knew the next few memories would be difficult to stomach, Izuku reluctantly showed him Aizawa's reaction to the costume, which had Hitoshi doubled over laughing and Izuku bright red with embarrassment. He laughed harder when the memory showed Kaminari teasing past Izuku, and present Izuku felt a warm spark in his chest as his guess about Hitoshi and Kaminari getting along was proven right. He showed the class testing out their support equipment, and himself getting used to the capture weapon so Hitoshi would know why he had changed the ones in their dreamscape. Then, hesitantly, he showed Bakugo waiting for Aizawa to look the other way before letting off a huge explosion, and he showed himself barely covering Jiro's ears in time. He toned down the volume in the memory though, so the blast was just a bit startling as opposed to brain-rattling. Hitoshi's jaw dropped at the massive explosion, speechless. He relaxed slightly when he saw Aizawa-sensei force Bakugo to hand over the gauntlets, but he still looked a bit pale. He barely even smiled when Izuku high-fived Uraraka and then had to turn himself into a balloon to avoid floating into the sun. Izuku skimmed through the first 2 battles, telling Hitoshi that they could go through them in more detail later if he wanted. He did leave in Aizawa's lecture about respecting boundaries and coming to him for help, just so Hitoshi knew he could probably be trusted. Taking a deep breath, Izuku let the memory of Aizawa announcing who his opponent would be, and Hitoshi winced slightly at the spike of fear that came through when Bakugo's name was called. He leaned into Izuku's side, already knowing that he wasn't going to like whatever happened next. Izuku just closed his eyes and let the rest of the memory play uninterrupted. Past Izuku laid out a plan, Uraraka agreed and huffed about Bakugo's bad attitude, which made Hitoshi let out a quiet, amused laugh, and the battle trials began. Hitoshi sat up slightly as he realized that this was the same memory Izuku had shown him before, only not edited this time. Izuku kept his eyes shut, listening to his past self fight, until Aizawa's familiar voice droned that Bakugo had been captured. Hitoshi sighed in relief and gave him a comforting squeeze, but Izuku still didn't look up, even as Bakugo screamed in fury and his past self's fear resonated through the two of them, making Hitoshi flinch. Past Izuku and Bakugo began to argue, and present Izuku tried his best to tune it out without accidentally stopping the memory. Hitoshi pulled him close as they listened to his past self rant at Bakugo, until he blurted out that he wished he had never saved Bakugo's life, making Izuku wince and Hitoshi inhale sharply. He quickly dragged a hand up and down Izuku's back to let him know that he wasn't mad, though. Izuku listened as his past self stormed away, only to collapse and have a mini panic attack about 2 hallways down. His nausea and horror and disgust and self-loathing came through so strongly it was nearly overwhelming, and present Izuku quickly tried to tamp down on it as Hitoshi clutched his hand and breathed slowly. Aizawa called out to past Izuku, startling him out of his daze, and he quickly forced himself to his feet and took off to go help his partner. After a quick discussion with Uraraka over the comms, Izuku ran to the nearest window and threw himself out without hesitation, making Hitoshi wince again. He barely caught himself with his capture weapon in time before he used it to fling himself up onto the roof. Then he crossed to the other side of the roof and threw himself off that too, crashing through the window to tackle Ida to the floor. Then Uraraka got the bomb, and just like that they won. Hitoshi bumped his shoulder gently, and Izuku peeled his eyes open as he skipped through most of the rest of the day. He left in some of Uraraka's teasing to lighten the mood, and some of Aizawa's lecture because he had some good points. He skimmed over Aizawa grilling him after class, because he hadn't given the hero anything to work with, which made Hitoshi give him a small frown that he ignored. Yeah, he knew logically that he should probably tell Aizawa-sensei everything Bakugo had done, but he couldn't. Not yet, at least. Izuku showed a few flashes of the past week, just to lighten the mood a bit. He showed Bakugo leaving him alone, the class voting for a president, some of Kaminari and Uraraka's jokes, some of Ida trying to show affection by giving them study guides, some of their theoretical heroics lessons that he thought Hitoshi would find interesting, and a few funny moments from their rescue training at USJ. He mumbled to Hitoshi that he would show him all of the heroics lessons in more detail later, so that he would be caught up when he joined their class. Hitoshi froze and stared at him in shock. Izuku blinked back. "You said when?" Hitoshi croaked. "Yeah," Izuku said, confused. "You know about the sports festival transfer, right? Toshi, there's no way in hell I'm letting you stay in Gen Ed if you still want to be a hero. I'm positive you could kick the butts of half my class without your quirk, and you could destroy all of them with it. And besides the fact that you deserve the spot, that you more than fit the criteria, I just dash." He paused and then looked down, trailing off into embarrassed mumbles. "I want you in my class." "Oh." Hitoshi breathed, looking stunned and conflicted. Izuku frowned and turned to face his friend, holding the other boy's face in his hands. "Hitoshi, listen to me," he said slowly. "You can be a hero. I believe in you. I believe in your strength, your determination, your compassion. I believe that you can do it, and I want to be there to see it happen. I want to help you achieve your dream, even if you don't really need my help." He gave a lopsided, self-deprecating smile. "We promised we would be heroes together, didn't we? I have no intention of breaking that promise. And I know that this change, it's scary. It's weird to suddenly have your friend go from imaginary to real. It changes a lot. But it doesn't change how I feel about you, Toshi. I trust you. I care about you. I want you to succeed and be happy. And if you'd let me, I want to be there by your side, succeeding with you." He tried to give his words the solemn weight they deserved, but like he had said, there was a change in the air now. Something like uncertainty and fear. He had believed it was impossible for Hitoshi to hurt him, physically or emotionally, but that suddenly wasn't true anymore. Sure, they had argued in the past, But Izuku had never once been worried about the other boy abandoning him or lashing out at him or anything. He still wasn't, not really, because he trusted Hitoshi. But now it was an option now, and that was just disconcerting. Hitoshi stared at him for a long moment, eyes wide and body motionless. It got to the point that Izuku was worried that he had done something wrong before the boy suddenly inhaled shakily and sagged into his arms, burying his face in Izuku's neck and shaking like he was trying not to cry. "Please don't take it back," he whispered, clutching Izuku to his chest. "If that was a lie, then please don't ever tell me the truth. Please become a hero with me. Please help me succeed, even if I don't need it. Please don't ever leave me." "Of course," Izuku replied immediately, wrapping his arms around Hitoshi's waist and holding him tightly as tears pricked his own eyes. "I won't ever lie to you, and I won't take it back. I won't give up on being a hero. I won't give up on helping you be a hero. And I'll never leave you behind, so long as you don't leave me either." "Never," Hitoshi said, and that one word was so heavy with promise that Izuku shivered under the weight of it. It took him a long moment to catch his breath again. 2 weeks. He mumbled, carting a hand through Hitoshi's hair. "We've got 2 weeks to open up a spot in my class for you, get the both of us used to fighting other people, think up our strategies, see what we can do about support equipment, try to get used us to fighting with pain, and try to figure out how we're gonna get you the #1 spot. Sounds like we've got our work cut out for us." Hitoshi said with quiet amusement. "That I don't need the #1 spot though, Izu. I just need to crack the top 3 to be guaranteed a transfer. And there's opportunities even if I do worse too." Izuku paused, sitting back to scan his friend's face. It wasn't like Hitoshi to shy away from doing his best, from striving to be the best. "You think there would be too much attention on you if you got first?" Izuku said, realizing what the problem was. Hitoshi nodded sheepishly. "Yeah, you are aiming to go underground, so a big spotlight on your career wouldn't be great, especially so early on. Well, that puts us in a bit of a pickle. Because I really want to see a bunch of stuck-up hero brats get there but kicked by a Gen Ed student." Hitoshi laughed quietly. "I thought those hero brats were your friends." He teased. "Toshi, I've known them for like 2 weeks. I've known you for 8 years. You do the math." Izuku replied, rolling his eyes. "Besides, they got their chance to show off during the entrance exam. This is your opportunity to shine." "Don't want to shine," Hitoshi muttered petulantly. "That's the whole point of going underground. I want to keep my face hidden. I'll figure it out," Izuku promised, fingers twitching with the urge to write in his notebook. He resisted though, mostly because he did not feel like writing the same thing twice, and he wouldn't be able to take his notes from the dreamscape into the real world. 2 weeks. That should be enough time. As long as you haven't been slacking on your training, of course," Izuku teased. Hitoshi straightened up and looked down his nose at Izuku, sniffing dramatically. "Of course not," he said with mock offense. "How dare you imply such a thing about me? I will never emotionally recover from such an egregious insult." "Then I guess you'll just have to die," Izuku said cheerfully. Hitoshi laughed, leaning down to touch their foreheads together with a little smile on his lips. Without thinking, Izuku reached up to cup his face, running his thumbs over the other boy's cheeks. Hitoshi paused, blinking in surprise, and Izuku went still, not sure what to do from there. The two of them sat there for a while, just looking at each other. It was a little awkward, but it wasn't uncomfortable or anything. It was more curious. When Izuku thought Hitoshi was imaginary, the line in the sand had been clear. Having an imaginary friend was all well and good, but having an imaginary boyfriend, his face turned pink at the mere thought of it, was way too pathetic even for him. So even if there was something more there, even if there was a moment of odd tension between them every once in a while, the two of them dutifully ignored it. But with this new revelation of realness, all of their previous boundaries and unspoken agreements had been blown out of the water. So here they were, towing the line. The uncertainty of it all had Izuku's heart thumping just as hard as it did when he let himself drop through the air in a freefall. It was an adrenaline rush that he would normally throw himself headfirst into, consequences be damned, But this time there's something more precious than his limbs or even his life on the line. If he went about this wrong, Hitoshi could get hurt in a way that Izuku didn't know how to fix. That thought was terrifying enough that for a while Izuku couldn't bring himself to do anything other than look. Then, finally, he began to slowly lean up, keeping his eyes locked on Hitoshi's as he searched for any hint of fear or disgust or anger. He found only confusion and wariness and something like tentative hope, but he also didn't have consent, and just not hearing a no wasn't enough. He wanted Hitoshi to say yes and mean it. So he paused again. Mere inches from his face, close enough that he could feel his labored breath, he paused. How far can I go? Izuku thought. Where will you stop me? Hitoshi didn't say anything. Didn't do anything. Just stared at him with those wide, hopeful eyes. He was scared too, Izuku realized. Scared of making the wrong move, doing the wrong thing. Scared to make that leap. That was okay. Izuku could be brave. That was what heroes were for after all. Kiss me? Izuku asked, in a voice so quiet and hopeful it even startled himself a little bit. Hitoshi froze, breath hitching and eyes widening. Izuku waited, trying not to fidget impatiently. He didn't know what he'd do if Hitoshi said no. Try to play it off as a joke, maybe. The very thought of it had dread and shame curling up in his gut, but luckily he didn't have to think about it for very long. Why yeah? Hitoshi breathed, gulping. Yeah, okay. Izuku let out a quiet breath, heady with relief. He leaned in slowly, giving Hitoshi one last chance to pull away. To change his mind. He didn't. Instead, Hitoshi leaned down and met him halfway, pressing their lips together so softly that Izuku hardly felt it at first. He couldn't help but smile into the kiss, just from how gentle Hitoshi was being. Seriously, he was acting like they hadn't sparred with hits hard enough to break bone just yesterday. Izuku threaded a hand through Hitoshi's hair and pressed insistently against the back of his head, pulling him in. Hitoshi's hands fisted in Izuku's shirt as he dragged him closer, kissing him long and slow. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Izuku reluctantly pulled away, red-faced and gasping for air. Hitoshi moved to follow him immediately, letting out a quiet noise of protest that had Izuku giggling breathlessly. Toshi, he murmured, cupping the other boy's face and grinning. Toshi, come on. Lunch will be over soon. Hitoshi shot him a glare that was dangerously close to a pout, face flushed pink. Not fair. Hitoshi muttered, ducking his head to nuzzle into Izuku's neck. Yes, I'm a big old bully. Izuku said affectionately, gently dragging his nails across Hitoshi's scalp in the way that always soothed him. Sure enough, the other boy melted in his arms, letting out a content sigh. Izuku grinned, Quirk positively thrumming with joy as he planted a small kiss on Hitoshi's hair. He couldn't remember ever having felt so warm before, like his whole being was glowing inside and out. He found that he didn't hate it. The two of them sat there for a while, just holding each other and breathing. And then, something weird happened. Midoriya? Izuku and Hitoshi both jumped at the voice. It was wobbly and a bit echoey, but if Izuku didn't know any better he would say it sounded like Aizawa-sensei. He and Hitoshi turned to look at each other with wide eyes, trying not to freak out, before Izuku suddenly realized what might have happened. Can we hear what's happening around our bodies when we're in here? He asked, baffled. Hitoshi relaxed slightly at the explanation and shrugged. I don't see why not. He said a little nervously. Does that mean we have to wake up now? Yeah, we do. Izuku admitted. He paused, and then sighed and leaned down to rest his forehead on the crown of Hitoshi's hair. We should probably hurry up. I don't want to know what he'll do if he can't wake us up. All right. Hitoshi mumbled eventually, planting a kiss on Izuku's shoulder. Reluctantly, Izuku gave Hitoshi one last squeeze before opening his eyes. To see a hand reaching for him. Instantly his heart lurched in fear. He batted the hand aside and threw one arm out to shield Hitoshi as he raised his other one in a guard, getting ready to fight or run. He didn't end up having to do either, because the person who was reaching for him was Aizawa-sensei. The man had stepped back the instant Izuku reacted, and was now standing a few feet away with his hands up placatingly. Was happenin'? Hitoshi mumbled, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. It seemed like he couldn't snap from sleeping to awake like Izuku did, simple as blinking. Sensei came to get us. Izuku reminded him, forcibly lowering his guard and trying to slow his breathing. Is lunch already over? He asked. Aizawa shook his head, putting his hands in his pockets. Your classmates were worried about you, Midoriya. Uraraka came to tell me that you were being bullied by a Gen Ed student. He paused and tilted his head at the way the two of them were curled up together, but Izuku hardly noticed because he had already burst into giggles. Even Hitoshi, half asleep as he was, covered his mouth to muffle a snort. Aizawa raised an eyebrow at them. Careful, Aizu. Hitoshi teased. The Gen Ed students are ruthless bullies, you know. You poor hero students should be careful. Izuku barked out a laugh that he quickly muffled. Sorry, sensei, he said, breathless with laughter. It's just a misunderstanding. I don't blame them for assuming that, but it's not true. Speaking of which, Hitoshi said, shooting him a glare. We're gonna talk later about you jumping out a window to avoid me. Izuku laughed nervously, avoiding his teacher's gaze as he climbed to his feet. Can you blame me? I looked up and you were just standing there. Izuku made a vague gesture with his hands as he helped the other boy to his feet. Hitoshi just sighed and shook his head, so Izuku turned back to his teacher. I'm really sorry to bother you though, but I promise Hitoshi isn't a bad person. He quickly dropped into a bow, and then cast a glance to the side to see that Hitoshi hadn't copied him, but was staring at his teacher with a defiant glare. Izuku kicked him in the shin, and with a quiet huff he also bowed slightly. Yes, sorry. Hitoshi muttered. It's fine, Aizawa said with a bit of wry amusement. Have you two had lunch yet? They both shook their heads, making the teachers sigh quietly. I figured. Lunch is almost over, so grab a snack from Recovery Girl and then get back to class. Your friends are still running around looking for you. Yes, sir, Izuku said, grabbing Hitoshi's hand and bolting out the door before he could pick a fight. Wow, Hitoshi said dryly, letting himself be pulled along. So your teacher really isn't an a-hole this year? Of course not, Izuku said indignantly. He's Eraserhead after all. Hitoshi nodded, accepting that explanation easily. Neither of them noticed when Aizawa's face turned red behind them. The two of them picked up a snack from Recovery Girl, Izuku apologizing again for the inconvenience, and then started to walk back to class. After a minute, Izuku realized he was still holding Hitoshi's hand and quickly let go, face turning pink. But being next to Hitoshi and not touching him felt weird, somehow, so he walked close enough that they bumped shoulders. What are you gonna tell your friends? Hitoshi asked, tilting his head. You know, about why you threw yourself out a window? Izuku bumped into his friend and shot him a pout. You're never gonna let that go, are you? Izuku said with a huff. I don't know though. Maybe something like long-lost childhood friend. What if you said I was presumed dead? Hitoshi said, smirking at the mental image. Ooh, what if we were both presumed dead? Izuku said, bouncing in excitement. Like, the last time we saw each other was in a burning building as kids, and I simply could not contain my joy upon seeing him again. He pressed a hand to his forehead and swooned dramatically, making Hitoshi snort. If you can pull that off, I'll never drink coffee again. Liar, Izuku said immediately. You wouldn't give up on coffee even if there was an apocalypse. Hitoshi rolled his eyes, and Izuku took the moment of silence as a chance to scan his friend. He looked different in the real world. A little sharper, in a way that made it suddenly obvious how hazy everything was in the dreamscape. He had light, barely visible scars on his cheeks and across the bridge of his nose, and he was more tense than he had ever been in the dream world. Izuku wasn't sure if he was imagining it, but his friend seemed taller too. And most notably, your voice is different out here, Izuku said. Hitoshi paused and tilted his head. Is it? He said slowly, like he was trying to listen to his own voice. Yeah, it's... Izuku trailed off, trying to find the right words. Deeper? Richer? It's sorta hard to describe, but it feels kinda like it echoes in my skull. I'll try and play the memory for you later. Ha! Hitoshi said, blinking. Yours sounds the same. A little more solid, I guess. Izuku nodded. It probably has to do with your quirk, then. Izuku said. A ton of people with voice quirks or mental quirks notice differences in their voice, and since you have both it makes sense that the difference would be more drastic. I can show you some dash. Midoriya. Both of them jumped and turned to see Kaminari come running down the hallway, chest heaving with Uraraka right behind him. Dude, are you okay? Is he dash? Uraraka. Izuku interrupted cheerfully, stepping forward to place himself between Hitoshi and his other friends. I heard you were looking for me. I'm sorry I worried you. I promise it was a misunderstanding. You see, this is Shinso Hitoshi, and he's my. Izuku trailed off, trying to think of the right word. Friend would put him on the same level as the other three, when he definitely wasn't. Only friend would just be rude. Best friend also seemed rude in a similar way. He's my imaginary friend. Izuku chirped, making the other three blanch. Oi! Hitoshi said, kicking him in the leg. That's the exact opposite of helpful. He paused and then dropped his voice into a whisper. Besides, you're my imaginary friend. Izuku laughed quietly and turned back to the other three. Right, so, it's kind of hard to explain, but basically Hitoshi and I are childhood friends? Izuku said with a sheepish smile. But why'd you run away from him? You jumped out a window. And, have you been crying? Uraraka fretted anxiously. WL. It's kind of a long story, but basically the last time we saw each other. He paused and looked down, taking a shaky breath like he was recalling a bad memory. We were in a burning building and I thought he didn't make it out. Then why'd he chase you? Uraraka asked, shooting a hard look at Hitoshi, who didn't even blink. Well, he thought that I didn't make it. So when he saw me, he kind of thought that I knew he was alive but let him think I wasn't. We cleared up the misunderstanding. Hitoshi, frowning slightly at Uraraka. Wait, so you saw your long-lost childhood friend. And your first response was to run away? Kaminari asked, blinking. Well, I have a very good explanation for that. Izuku said, holding up one finger. You see, I am very good at running away from my problems. Hitoshi hit a snort while Kaminari laughed, and even Uraraka smiled slightly. But everything's okay now? Uraraka pressed, glancing between the two of them. Yes, everything's fine. Izuku said, patting her arm soothingly. Uraraka nodded, but she still looked at Hitoshi with blatant distrust. He kept his face completely blank, but Izuku could still see how on guard his friend was. Well then, we've got to get back to class now, Uraraka said, grabbing Izuku's hand and tugging him down the hall. Hey, Uraraka dash. Kaminari began, startled by her insensitivity. Izuku barely noticed, already reaching out to grab Hitoshi's arm, yanking himself to a stop. Dash. Izuku said, face turning pink. You're in 1D, right? Hitoshi nodded, confused. I'll come find you. After school. So, wait for me. Hitoshi's expression softened. Sure. He said quietly. Don't take too long, all right? Yeah. Izuku said, brightening up. He let go of Hitoshi's arm with visible reluctance, letting Uraraka drag him away. Kaminari still looked a little nervous, but he followed them too. Once they got a few hallways away, Uraraka stopped and turning to Izuku with a serious expression. Midoriya, she said. I know that he used to be your friend, but that guy is really suspect dash. The irritation that had been curling up in Izuku's chest boiled over into anger. His expression turned icy cold as he drew himself up to his full-height hands fisted at his sides, startling her. I understand that you're worried. Izuku said, voice low and dangerous. I understand that you don't trust him yet. But I've known Hitoshi for 8 years. I've known you for 2 weeks. If you insult him in front of me. He stepped closer, glaring directly into her face. I won't ever forgive you. He stepped around her and walked down the hallway, leaving Uraraka with the gut-wrenching feeling of someone who had just made an irreversible mistake. Izuku spent the rest of the day in a daze. He couldn't bring himself to focus during class, instead either staring out the window with a soft smile or fidgeting and glancing at the clock. For once, he actually considered sleeping in class, but figured that Hitoshi would be pretty irritated if Izuku interrupted his class to pull him into the dream world without permission. He did feel kind of bad for not paying attention though, especially when present Mike-sensei nearly passed out when he asked him a question and Izuku replied with a cheerful, "I don't know." The hero had frantically asked him if he needed to go to the nurse, which made Izuku laugh and reassure him that he was fine. The second the bell rang, Izuku was out of his seat, throwing his backpack on and grinning widely. He bolted straight to the back of the room and jumped up, yanking the cover off the vent before pulling himself up into it. "A dash. And Midoriya, what are you dash?" Izuku paused, hanging half out of the vent, and turned to look at Ito with a wide smile, holding a finger up to his lips as the whole class stared up at him. "It's a secret," he said cheerfully, and then wiggled his way inside and closed the cover behind him. "Midoriya," Ida said incredulously, but Izuku was already crawling through the vents as quickly as he could. The 1D classroom was on the same floor as them, so Izuku made it there fairly quickly. The worst part was trying to avoid breathing in all the dust. By the time he got to the right classroom, he found Hitoshi standing outside the door, bag slung over his shoulder as he flipped through his phone. Izuku grinned, but just as he was about to drop down and surprise him, the door opened and present Mike walked out. He paused when he saw Hitoshi, blinking. "Ah, Shinso. Did you need something?" the hero asked. "Oh no, I'm just dash," Hitoshi started, and then paused and ducked his head, cheeks turning pink. "I'm waiting for a friend," he mumbled. Present Mike blinked, and then a wide smile stretched across his face. "Oh, a friend, huh?" he teased, making Hitoshi turn from pink to red. "Well, I'll get out of your hair then." The hero walked off down the hall, chuckling to himself. Hitoshi scowled and hid his face in his phone, muttering something under his breath, and the second he lowered his guard, Izuku kicked open the vent grate and dropped down. He beamed as he slammed into Hitoshi's back, wrapping his arms around his friend's shoulders as he opened his mouth to speak. His world tilted on its axis, and he felt his back slam into the floor seconds before a weight appeared at his throat and his oxygen was cut off. It took him a second of staring up into Hitoshi's steely gaze to realize that the other boy had flipped him over his shoulder and now had his forearm pressed against Izuku's windpipe. "Whoa," Izuku croaked, reaching up to grab his friend's wrist. "That was awesome, Toshi. You're getting better at that." Just as he began to speak, Hitoshi realized what had happened and quickly pulled back, face going pale with horror. "Jesus, Izuku, you scared the shit out of me. Were you in the vents?" "Ugh, you're covered in dust." "You are too," Izuku said, grinning as he planted a kiss on Hitoshi's wrist. "Well, such a shame, you can't go home looking like that, huh? Guess you'll have to come to my house and take a shower." Hitoshi stared at him incredulously. "You sly little sheet," he said, though his tone sounded more fond and amused than irritated. Izuku just smiled back, utterly unrepentant. "All right, fine then. I'll take you up on your kind offer." "Good," Izuku said, giving Hitoshi a pat on the shoulder that left a dusty handprint behind. "Now get off of me, I want to give you a tour of my house." Izuku dragged his friend out of the building and all the way to the train station, grinning and babbling about everything under the sun. As usual, Hitoshi didn't talk nearly as much as he did, but he wore a soft smile the entire time, and his eyes never left Izuku's face. They shared music on the train back, which was something that was remarkably difficult to do in the dreamscape since you had to have every beat of the song memorized or else it would sound weird and jagged. Izuku's good mood carried him the whole way, making his step light and his laugh easy. Right up until they got to his doorstep. There, he paused, shoulders tensing slightly before he took a deep breath and threw open the door. "I'm home," he called, and then relaxed when he got no response, sending his friend a grin. "Looks like Mom isn't home yet. Come in, let me show you my house. Look, this is the living room, I forgot to clean it last night. Hold on, don't look, go sit over there for a second Izuku flitted around anxiously, cleaning up some of the more obvious messes as he ignored his friend's quiet snickering. It wasn't filthy or anything, but there were more piles and clutter than he would like. He gave Hitoshi a quick tour of the house and then practically shoved him in the shower, not wanting to spend ages cleaning up dust later. While Hitoshi was showering, Izuku speed cleaned his room, and then spent way too long trying to decide which clothes to lend his friend while his school uniform was in the wash. Eventually he grabbed a plain gray t-shirt and a pair of shorts and shoved them through the door, face bright red. Luckily, their house had 2 bathrooms, so Izuku was able to take a quick shower himself before changing into a long-sleeve shirt and sweatpants. He frowned down at his clothes for a moment, trying to adjust them in a way that looked better, but ultimately gave up. It wasn't like he had any better ones. He only really had one person he wanted to dress up for, and he could summon whatever clothes he wanted in the dreamscape, so he generally just bought whatever was most comfortable. That would have to change. By the time he was done with that, he left the bathroom to see Hitoshi tapping at his phone while sitting on the couch. The shorts seemed to fit well, but the t-shirt was practically skin-tight, which made Izuku turn bright red and throw one of his hoodies at the boy and bolted into the kitchen to get started on dinner before he could embarrass himself by staring. Hitoshi's quiet laughter followed him, which was not appreciated. He wanted to cook something fancy, but they didn't really have much, so he ended up just deciding to make katsu curry. He put on some music as he cooked, in the hopes of drowning out his thoughts, and mostly succeeded. Hitoshi joined him soon after, leaning against the counter next to where he was chopping vegetables. "What are you making?" Hitoshi asked, leaning into his side. "Katsu curry," Izuku replied, bumping him with his hip. "Back up, I've got a knife." "Is that a threat?" Hitoshi said with a little smile, leaning against him again. Izuku rolled his eyes but didn't push him off this time. "No, you idiot, I'm saying I don't want to turn around and accidentally stab you." "HM. If you ever stab me, it'll definitely be on purpose," Hitoshi teased. Izuku snorted. "Absolutely. All it would take is one more comment about my height," he said. Hitoshi paused, and then a smirk spread across his face, so smug that Izuku shot him a glare before he even opened his mouth. "Don't you dare. I mean it, Toshi, I won't feed you. I'll just eat at night," Hitoshi said, ducking his head to rest against Izuku's shoulder as he wrapped an arm around his waist. "Dreamscape food doesn't count," Izuku said, nuzzling against his hair for a moment before weaseling out of his grip to grab a pot. "Besides, don't you want to taste my cooking? My real cooking, I mean." Hitoshi grumbled. "Fine." He followed Izuku over to the sink, leaning against him, only for him to then move over to the stove. What followed was a solid 5 minutes of Izuku bustling around the kitchen, trying not to laugh as Hitoshi followed him like a lost puppy, hugging him whenever he stopped moving. Hitoshi got visibly more frustrated as they continued on, until finally when Izuku was just starting to cook the onions, Hitoshi grabbed him by the waist and lifted him straight into the air before plopping him down so he sat on the counter. Izuku let out a startled yelp as Hitoshi immediately pressed against him, wrapping his arms around Izuku's waist and resting his head on his shoulder. Izuku laughed quietly and hugged him back. "Toshi, I'm cooking," he said affectionately. "I'll cuddle you later." Hitoshi grunted but didn't move. "You're a spoiled brat," Izuku said, leaning down to press a kiss into his hair. Hitoshi just squeezed him tighter and leaned into his touch. "Fine, fine." Izuku relented, putting down the spoon and reaching over to turn off the stove. "I'll cook later. But don't you dare start complaining if you get hungry." "K," Hitoshi mumbled, nuzzling against his neck. Izuku rolled his eyes and held him close, running a soothing hand through his hair. To be honest, it made sense that he was so spoiled. He never had to wait in the dream world, after all, and like many things, touch felt more solid in the real world. More comforting. So Izuku didn't really mind it when Hitoshi acted needy. If anything, it made him feel useful. The two of them sat together for a long while, slowly relaxing into each other, until Hitoshi suddenly kissed his shoulder and leaned back to look at him. Izuku paused, startled by the look on his face, and then Hitoshi glanced from his face to his lips with a sort of nervous determination, and he understood. Smiling softly, Izuku leaned down to kiss the other boy. Making sure to keep his every movement slow so he could pull away, he brushed their lips together. And then they heard keys rattling in the doorknob. They both immediately shot away from each other, faces bright red as Izuku scrambled off the counter and over to the stove, while Hitoshi leaned against the wall with his arms crossed. The door swung open, and Izuku's mom walked in, kicking her shoes off with a call of, "I'm home." She paused when she saw the extra pair of shoes by the door, and looked up in surprise to see the two of them standing there. "Oh, hello?" she said nervously. "Izuku, you didn't tell me that we had company." Sorry, Mom." Izuku said, equally nervous. This is Shinso Hitoshi, he's a friend from school. We're helping each other prepare for the sports festival." "Nice to meet you," Hitoshi said, bowing. "Oh, it's nice to meet you too. Are you going to be staying for dinner?" Inko fumbled over her words, glancing between the two boys. "Yeah, he is," Izuku said. "His house is pretty far from here, so he's gonna stay overnight too. Don't worry, we won't keep you up." Hitoshi shot him an odd look, but Izuku kept his gaze focused on his mom with a fake smile plastered across his face. "Yes, of course, that's fine," Inko said, wringing her hands as she approached them. What are you making?" "Katsu curry," Izuku said shortly. Inko nodded awkwardly. "Well, I'll go get changed then." "Okay," Izuku replied. She bustled off to her room, and Hitoshi turned to Izuku with a considering look. "I thought you said things were better between you and your mom." Hitoshi said. "That was better," Izuku replied, frowning down at the pot as he added the vegetables. "You'll notice that she didn't threaten to barricade me in room for daring to have a friend, and I didn't burst into tears the second she tried to talk to me." Hitoshi's brows shot upwards. "That bad, huh?" he said sympathetically. "Yep," Izuku mumbled, heating up the oil to start frying the chicken katsu. He squeaked in surprise when Hitoshi dropped a soft kiss on his neck and squeezed him gently before quickly moving away to begin setting the table, acting like nothing had happened. Izuku cooked the rest of dinner with a red face, pretending it was from the heat of the stove. Eating dinner with his mom was usually awkward, but having Hitoshi there made it so much worse. She spent the whole time asking Hitoshi pointed questions about his quirk, his friends, his future career, etc. Which meant Izuku spent the whole time redirecting the conversation to avoid such topics. If it hadn't been for Hitoshi holding his hand under the table, he probably never would have made it through that meal. The second the two of them were done eating, Izuku dumped their dishes in the sink and then practically shoved Hitoshi into his room, slamming the door behind him and tackling the other boy in a hug. Hitoshi caught him easily, probably having been expecting that, which Izuku really appreciated. "Sorry," Izuku mumbled, nuzzling into his neck. I was so excited to see you out here that I forgot about how she gets." "It's fine," Hitoshi murmured back, hugging him tightly. "I'd go through a million awkward dinners if it meant you stayed real." Izuku huffed out a quiet laugh and then pulled back, shooting him a small smile. "I'll stay real so long as I never have to eat an awkward dinner again," he joked, herding Hitoshi over to sit by his bed. The other boy huffed and rolled his eyes, but obediently sat where he directed. Izuku automatically waved a hand to summon a fluffy blanket, then paused and gave his arm a betrayed look when nothing happened. Hitoshi snorted, and Izuku shook his head and resorted to pulling a blanket off his bed and wrapping it around Hitoshi, grumbling about how inconvenient reality was. He pressed a quick kiss to Hitoshi's forehead before standing up and grabbing the notebook he had filled about the 1A kids and a separate blank one. Then he grabbed a pen, a pillow, and another blanket before sitting himself down on Hitoshi's lap, back pressed to his chest. Once he arranged the pillows and blankets to his satisfaction, he flipped open the blank notebook and tilted his head back to shoot Hitoshi a grin. "Okay," Izuku said. "Let me tell you about my foolproof plan to get you into my class." "Oh yeah," Hitoshi said with a little smile, resting his chin on Izuku's shoulder and snaking his arms around his waist. "Alright, tell me. So, first of all, we have to open up a spot for you. 1A is fully right now, so we have to get one of the students expelled." "I vote Bakugo," Hitoshi said. Izuku smirked. "What? And missed the chance to kick his butt on live TV. No thanks." Hitoshi snorted and nuzzled into his neck, and Izuku dropped a quick kiss onto his hair. My target is Mineta Minoru. He's a total perv with no regard for boundaries, and so far I haven't found a single redeeming quality about him. Luckily, we can use that to our advantage. He wrote down, "Get Mineta expelled," in the notebook. I'm thinking I can get most of the girls testify against him, and probably some of the boys too. I think the only one who ever willingly spends time with him is Kaminari, and even he agrees that Mineta goes too far sometimes. He wrote, "Compile evidence," under the first note. It's kind of lucky that you just happen to have a guy like that in your class. Hitoshi mumbled. So that I can take his spot without feeling guilty. He clarified when Izuku shot him an odd look. Izuku snorted. Well, yeah, I guess it could have been worse. Still, I wouldn't call having to put up with Mineta lucky. Hitoshi gave a quiet, understanding hum, so Izuku continued. That's part 1 of the plan. Part 2 is training, which can happen while I work on part 1. We need to get both of us used to fighting out in the real world, against other people and with pain. Gross. Hitoshi said, wrinkling his nose. Pain is this. It's not that bad. Izuku said, writing down problem 2 along with some classmates who they might be able to convince to spar against them. Adrenaline is wonderful painkiller. I hate that you know that. Hitoshi whispered, so quietly that Izuku probably wouldn't have heard it if the other boy's head wasn't directly on his shoulder. He didn't know how to respond, so he just changed the subject. Part 3 is support equipment. Izuku said, writing that down too. I thought only the support department was allowed to bring in support equipment. Hitoshi said, brow furrowing in confusion. Izuku shook his head. Nah, it's every department except the hero course. The only problem is you have to be the one to make whatever you bring in, so generally only the support course does it. I hate to break it to you, but I'm not exactly power loader. Hitoshi said dryly, raising an eyebrow. Izuku reached back and elbowed him in the ribs. That's why I have a plan. Or, well, the start of a plan. The rule says that any equipment you bring in has to be made by you, but there's no rule that says that all the pieces have to be made by you. For example, if you were building something like a blender, they wouldn't expect you to go out and forge the little blades from scratch. Why would you when you can just go out and buy it? Izuku paused, and after a beat Hitoshi let out a quiet oh of realization. So we're going to buy the pieces off of someone and have me. What? Put in the last screw. Ding ding ding. Izuku chirped, leaning up to press a kiss to his cheek. You get a gold star. Hitoshi blushed and grumbled in annoyance, but didn't move away. I have a bit of money tucked away from when I sold my All Might merch, and as long as we advertise the person in question there shouldn't be an issue. In fact, I have someone in mind already. He wrote down Hatsum Industries in his notebook. Is that the girl from that HeroTube channel you showed me? Hitoshi asked, peering over his shoulder to see. Sure is. Izuku replied, and his stupid little heart warmed a bit at the idea that he had remembered. She posted a video when she got accepted into UA, but I haven't gone to visit the support department to see her yet because I wasn't sure if that would be creepy. Luckily, this time, we're going with a business proposition, so it'll probably be fine. He paused as his anxiety crept up on him again. Probably. He shook it off and began writing again. So that's part 3 of the plan. Part 4 is strategizing. I can show you the memories of some of the 1A kids fighting, and we can plan how to take them down together. I'll have to see if I can get some footage of the 1B kids, and you can give me a rundown on the Gen Ed kids. I did some research into the sports festival itself, and it's usually a mass elimination event, a teamwork event, and then some sort of tournament. The mass elimination events are usually some sort of race, and both of us are pretty fast, but if worst comes to worst then I can carry you. He rambled on as he wrote each point down in his notebook. What about the identity issue? Hitoshi said, scanning the words over his shoulder. If people find out my quirk from watching the sports festival, then I'll be in real trouble as a hero. Well, I actually have 2 solutions for that. Izuku said, tapping his lip with his pen. One of them is just having you wear a mask during the sports festival, which I'll have to ask about, but Shoji is doing it so I think it'll probably be fine. The second solution is a clever little life hack I thought up called lying. Hitoshi snorted and Izuku shot a grin over his shoulder at him. Basically, when I introduce you to my class, I'll tell them that your quirk is activated through skin contact or eye contact or something. That way, when they're focused on not touching you, it'll be easier to get an answer out of them. Clever. Hitoshi hummed, but there was something odd in his voice that made Izuku pause and tilt his head back to look at him. What's wrong? Izuku asked. Hitoshi huffed and avoided his gaze. Nothing, it's just. He trailed off with a little sigh. Are you really okay with that? Lying to your friends? Yes. Izuku replied immediately, startling the other boy. What, did you expect me to be hung up about it? Because I'm not. I've known you for nearly 8 years now, and I've only known them for a few weeks. You do the math. Besides, they've got practically the entirety of hero society on their sides. Do you really think it's unfair for you to have one person on yours? Hitoshi wrinkled his nose, which would have been adorable if he didn't look so obviously troubled. I don't like making you choose between me and your friends. Hitoshi mumbled. Izuku frowned and flicked him in the forehead. You're not making me do anything. I'm the one who came up with the idea. He reminded. Hitoshi made a face and stuck his tongue out at him. Oh, fine then. I don't like feeling like I'm making you choose between me and your friends. He said. Izuku snorted. All right, fair. Izuku said, leaning into him. But I promise it's okay. I can think of something else if I need to, but I think this would be the safest option for you. No, it's a good idea, I just wish things were different. Hitoshi said, trailing off into mumbling. Then let's make it different. Izuku said as he tilted his head back to brush a kiss across the other boy's brow. Once we're heroes, we'll change everything. This stupid, might is right, society all might made, will make something good. Something fair. And we'll do it together. Hitoshi inhaled shakily, hiding his face in Izuku's neck and giving a short, stiff nod. Together, he whispered, in an almost reverent tone. The two of them sat in silence for a long while after that. Not for the first time, Izuku found himself a little awed by how easy and comforting it was to sit with Hitoshi and just breathe. Without warning, he wiggled out of Hitoshi's grip and turned around so they were sitting face to face, taking a moment to scan his face closely. It was Hitoshi. His Hitoshi, out here in the real world, sitting right in front of him and looking at him like he was the most beautiful thing in the world. There were differences from the dream world, but only slight ones. He had a tiny, pale scar across the bridge of his nose, he had a small chunk missing from his left ear, and his eyes were startling clear and bright. And yet, it was still undeniably Hitoshi. He hadn't changed a bit, from his nervous habit of tapping his fingers against Izuku's hip to his slow, knowing smirks that make Izuku feel a bit breathless to his kind, soft gaze. You're really real, aren't you? Izuku mumbled to himself as he reached down to thread their fingers together. If this is a dream, I hope I never wake up. Not a dream, Hitoshi said with a little smile, reaching forwards with his free hand to brush a strand of hair out of Izuku's. He paused then, the smile slipping slightly as his thumb passed over the tiny starburst scar on his temple, on that was usually covered by his wild curls. No scars in dreams. He murmured. Izuku watched in silence as the boy scanned him, running a hand down his face to his shoulder to his arm. Hitoshi pushed up his sleeve and scowled down at his scarred forearms, running his fingers over each one with a feather-light touch. Izuku felt his heart begin to pound in his chest as he watched his friend's expression turn more and more murderous with scar he found. He wasn't afraid or anything, he was more ashamed? Happy? Concerned? Honestly, he wasn't really sure. He just knew that he didn't really mind seeing Hitoshi get so angry over his pain. Was that selfish of him? Show me. Hitoshi asked suddenly, running a thumb over the little white lines on Izuku's knuckles. He kept his eyes locked on the scars, but Izuku could see the embarrassment and hope and vulnerability on his face. It took him a second to realize what the other boy was asking, and his breath caught when he did. Why you dash? Izuku hesitated, biting his lip. All of them? Hitoshi nodded. All of them. He mumbled, raising Izuku's hand to his face and pressing his lips to his knuckles. It wasn't exactly a kiss, it was barely even a touch, but it still made Izuku's heart race. Okay, Izuku croaked, hesitantly pulling his hand from Hitoshi's grip and standing up so he could peel off his shirt. He squeezed his eyes shut as he did, not wanting to see if there was pity or disgust in Hitoshi's gaze. A hand touched softly against his shoulder, and Izuku felt a small shiver go through him. He heard a soft noise, and opened his eyes to see Hitoshi had stood up and leaned forwards, right up into his face. Hitoshi! He squeaked. The boy didn't respond, just kept getting closer. Izuku stepped back until his knees hit the edge of the bed, and he fell backward onto it. Hitoshi maintained eye contact as he settled between Izuku's knees, arms propped on either side of his hips. It's not fair, Hitoshi murmured, taking Izuku's hand in his own. What isn't? Izuku choked out as Hitoshi planted a kiss on each one of his knuckles. This, Hitoshi said, kissing the large handprint scar on his wrist. And this, he added, kissing the burn scar on his inner forearm. And this, he said, kissing the small scar on his elbow. The entire time he kept eye contact. Izuku was sure the other boy could hear his heartbeat, given how loud it roared in his ears. Oh! Izuku breathed, wide-eyed as Hitoshi worked his way up his arm, trailing his lips over every single scar. There was no pity in his expression, or disgust, just acceptance, adoration. It was like his eyes were saying these are part of you, and I love you, so I love them. Izuku found himself utterly captivated by it, unable to tear his gaze away. Are you, everyone? Hitoshi mumbled as he kissed his shoulder. Everyone. A weird, warm feeling curled up in his gut as a shudder went through him when Hitoshi planted a gentle kiss on his neck. Izuku let out a quiet, breathy noise, feeling his face begin to heat up. Hitoshi kissed his collarbone, and then his sternum and then moved lower. That's dash. Izuku squeaked, utterly horrified to find that he was hard. That's enough, isn't it? Everyone. Hitoshi repeated, kissing along his ribs. Izuku's hands shot up to cover his face as his breath began to speed up, squirming unintentionally. Stay still. Hitoshi chided gently, pressing a hand against his hip to pin him down. Izuku let out a soft whine and pressed his hands harder against his face, trembling with the urge to move, to touch. He immensely regretted restricting his own vision when he felt hot breath against his skin, seconds before teeth sank into the flesh of his hip. Hitoshi! Izuku said, fully intending for it to sound scolding, only for it come out as a broken, pleading whimper. He slapped both hands over his mouth like that would take back the sound, looking down to see Hitoshi staring up at him with an equally wide-eyed, red-faced expression. And then Hitoshi shivered and ducked his head, pressing his forehead into the skin of Izuku's stomach. He breathed. That's not fair. And not fair? Izuku squeaked incredulously. Why you're the one who bit me? Sorry. Hitoshi mumbled into his skin, hands digging into the sheets on either side of Izuku's hips. I got greedy. I wanted to see what kind of cute face you'd make. Izuku felt like his face was probably on fire. He kicked Hitoshi in the thigh, covering his face again. You're the worst. Izuku said, trembling. This is so embarrassing. Why? Hitoshi asked, planting a kiss right on top of the bite mark. You don't want me to see? Izuku stiffened and propped himself up on his elbows, shooting Hitoshi a half-hearted glare. You can say that because you still have your shirt on, he said, pouting. Hitoshi blinked and looked down at himself like he hadn't noticed. Ah, he said. And then he hesitated, shrugged, and reached down to peel off his own shirt. Izuku let out a startled squeak and quickly reached up to cover his eyes, but Hitoshi grabbed his hand before he could. It's okay, he mumbled, quiet and embarrassed. If it's you, I want you to see it. All of it. All of me. Izuku opened his eyes slowly, unable to resist such a gentle plea, and then his embarrassment quickly faded into a quiet kind of horror. Hitoshi's scars were different from his own, more neat white lines than starbursts and handprints. From what he could see, most were around his shoulders and ribs, though the way they lay suggested the scarring on his back would be much more intense. Izuku ran his hands over them gently, as though he could wipe them all away with just a touch. And then, without warning, he reached up and dragged Hitoshi down to him, wrapping himself around the boy and squeezing him tightly. "Never again," breathed, a stony determination to his words. "I'll never let them hurt you again." Hitoshi chuckled quietly, wrapping his arms around Izuku and nuzzling into his touch. "You do know that heroes get hurt all the time, right?" he said dryly. "Not like this," Izuku mumbled, running a hand over Hitoshi's back. "There's no purpose in this. No bravery, or sacrifice, or determination. It's just suffering. It's cruelty, pain for the sake of pain. And I won't ever let them do it to you again." "You too," Hitoshi mumbled awkwardly, hiding his face in Izuku's neck. "I'll protect you too." The two of them sat there for a long time, just holding each other. Long enough that they slipped into the dream world, and still they did not move. Eventually, they returned to their planning, never letting go of each other for even a second. The minute Izuku opened his eyes the next morning, he decided that waking up in Hitoshi's arms was his new favorite thing in the world. He used to hate waking up, hate having to say goodbye to Hitoshi and step back into the real world, full of sharp edges and solid blows and pain. But now, Izuku smiled softly as he brushed a strand of Hitoshi's hair out of his face, burning the image of his sleeping face into his mind. Luckily, Hitoshi woke up slower than he did, so he had a long moment to sit and enjoy the warmth of sunlight streaming through the window and the boy pressed against his chest. "Zuku," Hitoshi mumbled, blinking blearily at him. And then his eyes widened and he let out a quiet, odd breath. "I'm awake," he breathed, tangling his hands in Izuku's hair. "And you're still here?" "Yeah, we are," Izuku said with a fond smile, leaning up to press a kiss to the boy's forehead. "We're still here." The only downside of cuddling with Hitoshi in a sunbeam was how unfairly difficult it was to get up. After a while, Hitoshi managed to force him to wake up by tickling his ribs, which sent them both rolling off the bed as Izuku retaliated with full force. They wrestled on the floor for a moment, cackling, until he managed to startle Hitoshi with a quick kiss that gave him room to pin the other boy down. "Gotcha," he said, grinning and panting with exertion as he licked his lips. Hitoshi froze, and then suddenly turned bright red, looking away quickly. "Get off of me, we have to go to class," Hitoshi muttered, squirming slightly. Izuku laughed but sat back, helping the other boy up. By then his mom had already left, so they were able to enjoy a nice, calm breakfast alone, even though they were in a bit of a rush to get to school early. Cooking with Hitoshi was also quickly added to his list of favorite things, even especially with the other boy constantly sneaking food or stealing kisses. They spent the train ride to school standing next to each other and whispering back and forth. It felt a little weird to spend so much time with Hitoshi, but not in a bad way. It was just different. Izuku thought he was rather starting to like different. Leaving Hitoshi's side to go to class was easier with the boy promising to meet up with him for lunch, so even though he was extremely nervous about what he had to do, Izuku was able to grab his notebook, get one last hug from Hitoshi, and march up to the top floor of the school. It took him a second to hype himself up enough to actually try to knock on the door, but when he did, it opened before his fist made contact anyways. He took a deep breath, stepped inside, and bowed politely. "Excuse me, Principal Nizu," he said, clutching his notebook to his chest. "I had a few questions about the rules for the sports festival." When Izuku left the room nearly an hour later, he was relieved to be able to say that their conversation had gone nearly as well as he hoped and far better than he expected. Almost all of his plans had been given the go-ahead, even some of his more outlandish ones that he really had no intention of using. He was a little creeped out by how often and how loudly the principal had laughed, but he figured that if Nizu was amused by him, then he probably wouldn't try to have him assassinated or something. God, that rat was scary. Besides plans for the sports festival, he was also able to get Nizu to confirm that he already knew about One for All, and that he would be willing to help cover it up. Izuku didn't want to do anything crazy, just spread some rumors about a previously quirkless kid showing up at the Shiketsu exams with a strength enhancement quirk to the seedier side of the city. He figured that a 200-year-old supervillain would be cautious enough not to attack a well-known hero school based on something as simple as a rumor, so he wasn't worried about putting the Shiketsu students in danger. He also got Nizu to agree to tell All Might that some villains had been lurking around Shiketsu and searching for a kid with a strength quirk in the hopes that the hero would begin visiting the school, giving more credibility to the rumor. All for one would probably recognize his quirk during the sports festival anyways, but for now he could try and direct attention away from himself and Yue and Hitoshi as much as possible. When Nizu prodded him about sharing the secret of One for All with Aizawa-sensei, Izuku awkwardly mumbled that he would think about it, but begrudgingly gave the principal permission to tell Aizawa about it if there was ever some sort of emergency. It wasn't that he didn't trust the man, it was Eraserhead after all, but, well, these days he knew better than to blindly put his faith in heroes. Still, he got the information and the permission he needed, so any chaos he caused in the future was certifiably not his fault. He was even able to get to class before the bell rang, sending a text to Hitoshi saying that everything had gone well, though that unfortunately left Izuku alone to deal with his classmates' questions about his trip out the window and through the vents. He did his best to play off their questions with nervous laughter, just saying that he had been in a hurry before whispering to his friends that he would explain everything during lunch. He even managed to actually pay attention in class this time, to present Mick's visible relief. By the time the bell rang, he was eager to go. He shoved his stuff in his bag, grabbed his friends and dragged them out into the hall, only to see Hitoshi there, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. His face was pink and his chest was heaving, despite the way he was visibly trying to slow his breathing. Without thinking, Izuku blurted out the first thing that came to mind. "Did you run all the way here?" he asked. Hitoshi's face went from pink to red even as his expression stayed perfectly blank. "No." He lied blatantly, scowling when it just made Izuku laugh. "I didn't." He insisted. "I just walked swiftly." Yes, you're a stoic badass who never smiles." Izuku teased, bumping his shoulder. "Now come on. Let's go to the lunchroom. You guys too." Izuku called over his shoulder to his friends, who scurried after them. "See how stoic I am when I knock your butt out." Hitoshi muttered. Izuku saw Uraraka and Ida tense out of the corner of his eye, but conversely he perked up. "Oh, do you want to spar after school today? If we ask, maybe Sensei will let us use the gym," he said excitedly. Hitoshi paused and then nodded. "Sounds good. See if you can bring your hero costume, I want to check it out." Hitoshi said. Use of hero costumes outside of practical heroics class is forbidden. Ida said, chopping his arm as he glanced between the two of them nervously. Hitoshi's eyes narrowed slightly, but Izuku cut in before he could say anything. "Dming. It'll be fine if we get Sensei's permission, right?" he said cheerfully. Ida nodded awkwardly as he looked away in embarrassment, and Izuku took the opportunity to stand on his tiptoes to whisper into Hitoshi's ear. "He's not trying to be rude, he's just trying to look out for us so we don't get in trouble. He's not good at expressing his feelings yet, but he's getting better." Hitoshi's expression smoothed out as he gave a short nod. Izuku flashed him a smile and squeezed his arm in silent thanks for his understanding, then stepped away as they walked into the lunchroom. It didn't take long for them to find a table. Once they did, Izuku grabbed Hitoshi and forcefully sat the boy next to him, shooting a cold look at Uraraka who had tried to step between them. It wasn't that he didn't understand where she was coming from, he really did. He knew how suspicious the two of them must look from the outside. But seriously, this was high school. She didn't have to treat every suspicious student she met like they were already a villain. Hitoshi had experienced that enough already. "Wow, your food looks good," Kaminari said, startling Izuku out of his thoughts to see the boy drooling over Hitoshi's bento. "I'm jealous. You're literally eating food made by Lunch Rush," Hitoshi said, hunching over his bento protectively. "You know, the cooking hero? Keep your paws to yourself. 'Tis human nature to want what we cannot have." Kaminari replied dramatically. "It's a FING bento, Socrates, not the meaning of life." Hitoshi snarked. Izuku saw the instant he realized that might have been a bit too rude as he faltered, but Izuku pressed their legs together to comfort him as Kaminari pouted. It's a delicious-looking bento. He corrected, and Hitoshi relaxed slightly at how unaffected he was. Izuku smiled fondly as he picked up a slice of katsu from his own bento and held it out to Kaminari. "Here, you can have some of mine if you want," he said, ignoring Hitoshi's betrayed look. "We have the same thing anyways." Kaminari blinked in surprise, glancing between their two lunchboxes. "Oh, you do? What a coincidence," he said as he grabbed the katsu from Izuku's chopsticks and bit into it, letting out a happy little hum. Izuku laughed as Hitoshi turned bright red and hunched his shoulders. "Yeah," Hitoshi muttered. "Coincidence." "Is it a coincidence?" Uraraka asked, fake lightly. Hitoshi shot her an annoyed look, but Izuku hooked their ankles together to comfort him and smiled brightly. "No, it isn't. I cooked lunch for Hitoshi and myself today." "Well, and Kaminari too," Izuku said, shooting an amused look at Kaminari as he placed another piece of katsu on the boy's tray. "You're a really good cook," Kaminari said, tossing it into his mouth quickly. Izuku smiled gratefully, pretending not to notice how Hitoshi snuck a piece of his own lunch onto Izuku's plate. "So how did you two meet?" Uraraka asked. Both Izuku and Hitoshi froze, shooting each other a wide-eyed look. "Oh shit, how are we going to get out of this one?" Hitoshi's expression said. "If I know. Quick, come up with something." Izuku shot back with a little JRK of his head. "Me? She's your friend, you do it." Hitoshi told him with a glower. "Yes, because that ended so well last time," Izuku said through his rolled eyes. He shook his head, sighed, and turned back to Uraraka. "We met when we were kids, so I really don't remember," he said, tilting his head and smiling. Uraraka shot him a look of blatant disbelief, and Izuku cursed his inability to lie on the spot. "It's the same with me and Kaken," he added, just to give his story more credibility. "Don't call him that," Hitoshi said suddenly, his voice low and dangerous. Izuku startled at his tone, turning to look at him in surprise. "He doesn't deserve that," he added even quieter. "It was just force of habit," Izuku assured him as he lay a gentle hand on the boy's back, resisting the urge to lean up and kiss his forehead. Hitoshi nodded, though he still glowered down at his food. "Do you and Bakugo know each other?" Ida asked curiously. Hitoshi's eye twitched as Izuku winced. "Yeah, I know all about Bakugo," Hitoshi snarled. "Hitoshi," Izuku said warningly. The boy obediently took a deep breath, sitting back and smoothing out his expression into its usual blank look. "Izuku has told me a lot about him," he said. Izuku gave him a little pat on the back and turned back to his friends with a wry smile. "As I'm sure you've noticed, Bakugo and I aren't exactly close anymore. But we used to be friends when we were really little, so it's hard for me to remember not to call him like that anymore," he explained. "Ooh, a dramatic backstory," Kaminari said cheerfully, leaning forwards and propping his chin on his hand. "Tell me all about it." "If only I could," Izuku thought, trying not to groan. He saw Hitoshi start to say something, so he reached down and grabbed the boy's hand, shaking his head just slightly. "My quirk is very destructive," Izuku said slowly, trying to think of how much he should say. "Well, you saw me during the entrance exam, right?" "Sure did. You were terrifying," Kaminari said with a dopey grin that didn't match his words at all. Izuku felt himself blush slightly as Hitoshi's hand tightened around his. "Why yeah," he said, smiling nervously. "Well, go ahead and try and imagine that much power in a 4-year-old's body." Instantly, the mood at the table soured. Kaminari's smile slid into a look of wide-eyed horror as he straightened up. Uraraka quickly went pale and Ida choked on his food, and Izuku let his smile settle into something a bit more wry. "Don't worry, it didn't come to that. Luckily, my body had a built-in safety function, so it didn't manifest until I built up enough muscle mass for it. Even with that, it took a while for me to be able to use it without any pain. Still though, I think I'm pretty good with it now, yeah?" he said, flashing a cheerful smile as he raised a hand and clenched it into a fist. His classmates all relaxed, shooting him relieved looks. "Geez, you scared me for a second there," Kaminari muttered with a sheepish smile. I thought something bad happened. Izuku practically felt Hitoshi start to bristle at the dismissal, unintentional as it was, and he quickly ran his thumb over the boy's knuckles to soothe him. Have you ever met a quirkless person before? Izuku said, with a fake kind of cheer that had the rest of the students on edge even as Hitoshi relaxed, trusting him to handle this. All of them shook their heads, seeming a bit confused. Weird, isn't it? Not counting false negatives like me, quirkless people make up 20% of the population. That's 1 in 5. And yet, you've never met one in real life. So where did they all go? He batted his eyelashes innocently, watching all 3 of them consider that for a second. Well, that's 20% of the global population, right? Ida said, a bit nervously. Isn't the number a bit different in Japan? Yeah, I don't remember the percentage here, but it's like 40% in New Zealand, right? Uraraka said. Izuku paused, blinking in surprise before his expression softened. Honestly, that was more information that he had expected them to have. 43% in New Zealand, about 8% here in Japan. Izuku said, picking at the scars on his knuckles absent-mindedly. That's just an estimation, of course. But still, 8%. Rounding up, that's nearly 1 in 10, again not counting false negatives who may go their entire lives thinking they're quirkless. And yet, all 3 of you have never met someone like that. Isn't that weird? Where do all of them go? Izuku felt himself smile at their wary looks, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was more of a placeholder expression, since he wasn't really sure what face he should have been making right then. It's quite simple, really. They're dead. Kaminari choked on his water. To be more specific, they kill themselves. 64% of all quirkless people in Japan kill themselves before they turn 19. And that's not to mention the estimated 10% that do it later on in life, or those who die to domestic abuse or hate crimes or victims of child abuse or SXL assault or dash. Hitoshi clicked his tongue. Instantly, Izuku felt silent, taking a deep breath to center himself as he realized that he had picked at the scars on his hands hard enough to draw blood. He sent Hitoshi a sheepish smile, then turned back to his friends with a more stable expression. So no. Izuku said. Nothing bad happened to me. I was lucky enough for my quirk to manifest before things got that bad. Hitoshi had an expression like he disagreed with Izuku's trivialization of his experiences, but he didn't argue. Still, it is a tiny bit jarring to go from thinking I'll be dead by 22 in UA's hero course. He shook his head, took a deep breath. But that's besides the point. The point is Bakugo and I grew up in an unwelcoming environment. He was a child, and he employed what the grown-ups taught him. I don't blame him for that, but I do wish he'd get off my butt about it these days. Well, Kaminari said faintly, looking dazed. That is a hell of a backstory. You don't know the half of it. Hitoshi mumbled, and Izuku elbowed him. Ida and Uraraka still looked like they were going to be ill, so he quickly changed the subject. Well, now that that's out of the way, how do you guys feel about meeting up to spar after school? Izuku said cheerfully. The others blanched at his blatant redirection. Wait, don't you have that thing after school? Hitoshi said, used to his antics. Izuku stared blankly back at him. You know, with the support girl. Oh. Izuku said. Right, handsome? Yeah, talking with her is probably going to take a while, so I'll have to do that after we spar. Hitoshi raised an eyebrow at him. Izuku, he said quietly. Neither of us are going to be doing anything after we spar, except maybe going to Recovery Girl. That's not true. I know how to hold back these days. Izuku protested as his face turned pink. We'll move the fighting back to tomorrow. Hitoshi said, rolling his eyes. Fondly. Hatsum will need some time to decipher your designs anyways. Are you having problems with your hero costume? Ida asked, brows furrowed with concern. Oh no, I just had a few ideas for extra equipment after the battle trials. Izuku lied smoothly. Also, I'm just kind of curious about the process behind making support equipment. That part was technically true. I'll talk to her about it after school today, but if you guys want to meet up tomorrow, that'd be great. He made sure to put a bit of emphasis on the I, implying that Hitoshi wouldn't be there. Uraraka relaxed as all three of his friends agreed to meet up the next day after school, and they finished their lunches on far lighter topics. After school that day, he walked his friends out of the building, waved them goodbye with a smile, then turned and bolted back into the building. He ran all the way to the support course classroom, where Hitoshi was standing outside of it waiting for him. After tackling the boy in a hug, real, he grabbed him by the arm and tugged him over to the classroom. As he pulled the door open, he looked around to see most of the students had already left, so he went straight to Power Loader's desk. The man was slumped over, glowering at his computer, and Izuku had to clear his throat 3 times before he caught the hero's attention. Hello, Majima-sensei said, squinting at them. You're not one of mine, are you? No sir, we are not. Izuku said, clutching his notebook to his chest and practically vibrating with excitement. We're here to talk to one of your students, actually. Is Hatsume here? At the exact same time, Power Loader went rigid, someone across the room shrieked, and an explosion went off. Hitoshi and Izuku both startled, but Majima-sensei just groaned and put his head in his hands. In the back of the room, there was now a small scorch mark on the wall and the desk by it, and the girl at the desk stumbled away from it as she pulled her goggles up onto her forehead. Ooh, that one nearly took my head off, she said, cackling. Did someone say my name? That depends, Izuku said, grinning back at her. Are you Hatsume, future CEO of Hatsum Industries? I sure am, Hatsum said, sounding utterly delighted as she scurried over to them. You know me. Wait, she squinted at his face. Do I know you? Not yet. Izuku replied, sticking his hand out. My name's Midoriya Izuku, this is Shinso Hitoshi, and we'd like to strike a deal, if you please. This is a nightmare, Majima-sensei whispered into his hands. I'm dreaming, this is just a nightmare, there's no way that there's more of them. A deal? What kind of deal? Hatsum asked, brushing some soot off of her hair and clothes. Izuku flipped open his notebook to the page labeled HI and passed it to her. I'd like your help putting this plan into action. The designs are on the next few pages. Oh, and you would be compensated for your efforts, of course. Izuku flashed a dazzling smile as she scanned the page. She paused, whistled, and then raised an eyebrow at him. Is this legal? She asked. I already got Nizu's permission, so if it isn't then that's not our problem. Izuku said cheerfully. Majima-sensei sobbed. Sounds good to me. Hatsum said, flipping to the next page. Her gaze flicked back and forth across it, and then her eyes widened and she began to vibrate with sheer delight. Hitoshi shifted to hide behind Izuku. After a long moment, she snapped the notebook shut and grabbed Izuku with a wide smile. Please, she breathed, getting right up into his face with excitement. Please let me make your babies. The choking noise Hitoshi made was comedy gold. He grabbed Izuku and yanked him back out of Hatsum's grip, shooting her a vicious glare. Absolutely not. He snarled. He looked like he had quite a bit more to say, but Izuku laughed and patted his arm soothingly. By babies she means inventions, Toshi, remember? Izuku said. Of course I did. What else would I mean? Hatsum said, rolling her eyes. Hitoshi squinted at her, not sure if she was joking or not, but then Izuku gave him a look like, just roll with it, and he settled back with a little huff. I would be honored to have you bring my ideas to life. Izuku said with a dramatic bow that made her giggle. We are prepared to compensate you for the materials, of course, along with the publicity you'll get when Hitoshi wins the sports festival with the help from your equipment. Oh, so you want me to bet my babies on whether or not this kid is gonna win? Hatsum asked, eyeing Hitoshi with a critical sort of amusement. Well, usually I would be more discerning with my business partners, but I like your style, Greenie. You've got yourself a deal. She held out a hand, and Izuku shook it with a wide smile. W.T. Hitoshi said, looking back and forth between the two of them with wide eyes. Are you serious? You don't even know anything about me. What if I don't win? You will. Izuku reassured him. You have more training than all of these brats combined, except maybe Todoroki, but I've already got plans for him. You know I wouldn't ask her to invest in you if I wasn't sure. Hitoshi blushed, but shot him a hard look. Yeah, well, what if you win? You have just as much experience as me. He grumbled. If I win, I get bragging rights, and you'll never let that happen. Izuku said, patting his arm. Besides, that's half the fun. What's the point of a gamble if you already know how it's going to turn out? Exactly. Hatsum said cheerfully. If I invest in you and suffer losses because of it, then that just means I need more practice picking my business partners. Hitoshi stared at her, then at Izuku, then back to her. Something like realization flashed across his face and he groaned, dropped his head into his hands. Oh my God, he whispered. You're both crazy. Oh really? What tipped you off? Izuku asked with a wry little grin. Crazy. As a cow. Hatsum agreed, then turned to Power Loader. Majima-sensei, can we dash? No. Power Loader said immediately. No, just dash. He paused, raked a hand down his face with a sigh. If you have Nizu's permission, it's fine. Do whatever you want. Just don't tell me about it. At least let me have some level of plausible deniability. Izuku elected not to tell him that plausible deniability didn't apply if the culprit was a child under your care, instead dipping into a bow. Thank you for your time, sensei. He said, smiling politely. The hero just grumbled and waved him off. Great. Now come on, Greenie, let's talk business. Hatsum announced cheerfully, grabbing him by the arm and tugging him further into the massive classroom. Izuku grabbed Hitoshi and pulled him along as well, and the three of them sat down to bargain.